Hello, everybody. If I could have your attention, welcome. Thank you all in the room who've braved the weather here in New Hampshire to be here, and those who are joining us remotely. I'm Michael Ettlinger. I direct the Carsey School of Public Policy here at the University of New Hampshire, and this forum is sponsored by the Carsey School, the Institute for College Access and Success, and UNH's student organization, the Campus Living Council. And if you want more information on any of these organizations, if you're in the room over there, and if you're remote, I'm sure you can find us online. The subject of today's forum is college costs and debt, a topic of great interest on, I suspect, every campus in the country. It's on parents' minds. It's certainly on the minds of those who are paying off their student loans. The good news is it's also on the minds of the women and men who are running for president of the United States. And that's a level of political salience for this issue that we have not seen in the past, and likely a harbinger of eventual action. So yesterday, the Carsey School released a brief called Rising Student Debt and the 2020 Election by James Quall and Jessica Thompson of the Institute for College Access and Success. And it briefly outlines the extent and nature of the challenge and summarizes the types of proposals offered by the candidates, both those of whom will be appearing here later and those who are not. And one of the things that's really clear is that these plans vary, and we're going to hear a lot about how they vary. So to do that, we have a panel of experts that are going to talk about both the substance of the issue and the different policies that are being proposed and how it's playing out in the campaign. And of course, we'll be hearing from the candidates themselves. So I look very much forward to that. I would encourage people, there will be candidates here who you are more or less interested in. One of the things that I've really learned through this process here in New Hampshire of having a lot of different candidates come through and going to hear them, they're all pretty interesting people who have interesting things to say. And so I would, even if it's someone you're unlikely to vote for or unlikely to be president in your view, I would encourage you to stick around for all of them, because I think you'll learn a lot and learn about the sort of different tensions around this policy area as you hear their differing approaches. So thank you again for being here. Two more things to do before we get to the meat of the agenda. First is Tyler Silverwood, who's Vice President of the Campus Living Association, will join me in welcoming you. And the other, then I will read a legal disclaimer, which is something for you all to look forward to. But Tyler, he's a sophomore here at UNH and Vice President of the Campus Living Association.
Thank you all for coming out today. As Michael said, I'm Tyler. I'm a sophomore studying biochemistry here at UNH. And as a vice president of CLA, the Campus Living Association, I've had the great opportunity to meet a wide variety of students across campus about what they would like to change on campus. And without fail, that conversation always comes back to the sky-high cost of college. And I'd bet that 1 in 10 jokes here on campus are made about the cost of college, and I'd bet my financial aid on that. So it's really always on our minds about when tuition is due, how we're going to pay for it now, and even more importantly, how we're going to keep paying for it years from now. And UNH is really a perfect microcosm of what's happening with the rising costs of college and the nation. Our state tuition is one of the most expensive in the country, and costs of attendance have risen dramatically over the last decade. But as Michael said, being students in New Hampshire does provide us with one great benefit, and that's that presidential candidates care about us. They listen to us. They've heard the voices of students, not just here at UNH, but across the entire country, and they've made college reform a centerpiece of their platforms. And as we'll hear later, each candidate has their own perspective on how to solve this higher education crisis, from providing citizens $1,000 a month to making public colleges free and reforming the federal loan system. Everyone from college students to those who have already graduated, and even the parents and grandparents who have to support them, know how important it is for the next president to get this problem right. New Hampshire voters know how important their role is in this election, and in fact, a student meeting a presidential candidate on Tuesday even brought their laptop to take notes. That shows commitment. So to the presidential candidates and panelists, thank you for listening to us students and for proposing unique and revolutionary ideas to solve this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Tyler. And now the legal disclaimer. This event is sponsored by the Carsey School of Public Policy, the Institute for College Access and Success, and the Campus Living Association. The use of the University of New Hampshire's facilities for this event does not constitute an endorsement by the university. The University of New Hampshire and the Institute for College Access and Success do not endorse the candidates appearing here today or any other candidates or organizations in connection with this or any other political campaign or election. With that, I would like to invite up our panel to start today's program. I will introduce them as they're coming up. We have Adam Harris, who will be moderating today. He is a staff writer at The Atlantic and an expert on higher education who is covering the presidential elections campaigns, and he was formerly at the Chronicle of Higher Education. Daniela Gibbs-Leger is the Executive Vice President for Communications and Strategy at the Center for American Progress Action Fund, and among other illustrious stops in her career, she was a special assistant to the president and is frequently called on by the media for her insightful commentary. James Quall is the president of the Institute for College Access and Success, our partner in this event, and one of the authors of the piece I mentioned. And he previously served as the Deputy Domestic Policy Advisor at the White House, and among other impressive jobs, he also was the policy director for 2 presidential campaigns, including in the 2012 campaign of President Obama. So with that, I'll hand it over to Adam to moderate this panel. Thank you a lot.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for coming. I guess we should start this conversation. As you mentioned, as Michael mentioned a little bit earlier, we kind of saw more energy around higher education earlier in the campaign season than we've kind of ever seen before, where candidates were kind of acknowledging that this is a crisis. So James, I wanted to go to you first to ask a very simple question of how did we get here?
Good question. I agree. It's unprecedented the amount of attention that college affordability is getting on the campaign trail. And for a long time, student loans seem like an easy answer. They have no cost to the federal government, obviously no cost to states or to colleges. And when people asked, is debt too large, people would say, well, a college degree is worth $1 million over the course of a lifetime, and an average student debt is only $30,000. So that seems like a small price to pay. And I think what has changed is, one, borrowing has gone up a lot since the Great Recession, and I think people don't fully realize, over the course of a couple of years, states cut funding per student at public colleges, where 3/4 of students go, by $2,000 per student per year, and borrowing went up by $1,100 per student per year. So that's a pretty substantial increase in student debt. And I think the other thing that's happened is we have better information now, and the idea that all students graduate from college and go on to do well in the labor market, we know is really not true, and a lot of students are struggling with their loans.
Yeah. And so Daniela, just thinking about how we've this issue has been exacerbated since 2008. We've gone through several iterations of why it's a bigger problem. I think. Why do we kind of understand that the federal government has a bigger role to play in this, right? You have the Secretary of Education, whose biggest job is actually overseeing higher education, even though K-12 gets more play. I guess why do candidates see this as something that they need to focus on now a little bit more?
Well, I think it's because it affects so many people now. As James said, more and more people are borrowing. They're borrowing more and more money, but also people like the Obamas were very public, right, about when they finally paid off their college loans when they were in the White House. And so I think the issue is affecting more people who are coming of age, who are thinking about what's going to happen to their children when they go to college. And the stark contrast between this administration and the previous administration in looking at this issue, I think that is why presidential candidates feel like they have to address this. They have to take this on.
And there, of course, I should acknowledge that there is a pretty stark contrast between how this issue should be tackled among not only the Democratic candidates, but also between Democrats and Republicans. So I wanted to ask both of you, just generally, there's kind of a split, right? This kind of partisan divide on higher education, where I think 73% of Republicans have some sort of mistrust in higher education. So I guess where did that partisan divide come from? Has it always been like that? And what does that mean for the nation's colleges and universities?
I'll take first swing. Okay. It's really something that's gotten a lot worse over the last couple of years. And I think part of it has to do with growing attention to policing of speech culture on campuses. But I really think fundamentally there's a growing cultural divide in our country, and on one side of forces of cosmopolitanism and diversity, and on the other side, communities see their best and brightest going off to the state flagship university and then moving to Boston or moving to Chicago. And so they don't see higher education strengthening their communities. They see it taking some of their young people away. And so I think there is a real challenge for higher education in that it has such potential to be a source of economic growth and shared prosperity, but it doesn't, the communities that are struggling don't get the same amounts of benefits.
And actually, to that point, one state in Tennessee, right, where you have a Republican governor, you have a Republican legislature, they've actually been pretty progressive in terms of supporting tuition-free college, kind of having the model for tuition-free community college. Why do you think they were able to do that in a more conservative state?
It is interesting. There seems to be a bit of a divide between free community college and free college for all. I'm interested for Daniela's thoughts on this too. But of course, the first person to college was free in California until the early 80s. But in recent times, it was a Republican governor of Tennessee, Governor Haslam, who made community college free in Tennessee, and that was inspiration for President Obama's plan. And even now among Democratic candidates, among candidates for governor, we'll hear from Governor Weld, who's a Republican who is for free community college. And then among Democratic candidates, you have a range of people who are talking, some for free community college, some for all types of public colleges and universities. And I think Representative Gabbard is even for making tuition free at private, historically black colleges. And those are really when you extend it to four-year institutions, you're talking about something that is much more expensive and that is serving a different kind of student.
Yeah, I think the divide within the Democratic Party on this issue is very interesting. And I think you get to the point, the free community college is sort of seen by some as the bare minimum, that is the floor. And I think there are some people who believe that if you extend it to four-year colleges, that people who don't necessarily need to have access to that, people who are wealthier, people who have more means, do they really need to have free tuition provided to them? And the other side of that coin is, if you look at college as a public benefit, if you look at it like the way you look at K through 12 education, we don't do means testing for K through 12 education, so why are we doing it for higher ed? I don't personally have an opinion on this because I go back and forth and I can argue either side of the coin like any good communications person could do, but it's a really fascinating debate. But I just love the fact that we're having this debate and that at the bare minimum it seems that it is bipartisan support exists for at least free community college.
I wonder what you think, because I know you've written some about the politics of Republicans in higher education.
Yeah, it's there's actually an interesting thing happening nationally between, if you're looking at the 2016 election, you look at the 2018 election, one of the most interesting things is kind of the growing education divide between kind of white voters without college degrees and white voters with college degrees, where white voters with college degrees tend to trend towards the Democratic Party. And white voters without college degrees tend to trend towards Republicans. So there's this potential for this interesting dynamic where Republicans might see their base as those who may agree with them that, well, college might be a waste of money. We may be wasting public resources on higher education, particularly if they are, over-policing speech or any of these sorts of things. So there is this as you mentioned earlier about states cutting back on their higher education budgets. There's a potential that more states will be kind of more emboldened to cut back on those budgets and in this situation. But I think kind of blowing this back out to the national stage, there's this interesting question right now of, nearly all of the candidates who we'll hear from today are going to be to the left of Congress on the issue of kind of tuition-free college, regardless of whether it's 2-year community college or 4-year. So I guess how do any of these candidates get this done, being to the left of the Senate on this?
So that's a good question. I don't know that they can. A lot will depend on what happens in November, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't push for it. As we saw in 2007 and 2008, to lead up to that election, the House and Democrats, they passed a lot of bills that went nowhere. People advocated for a lot of things that went nowhere. But then when Democrats took over the White House, when they took over the Senate, there were all these bills that were languishing that went nowhere, but then they had a template to move forward. And also, it's about pushing the conversation in the direction you want it to go. We have this conversation internally at our organization all the time. And we believe that it is important to, regardless of what's happening in DC, to advocate for what you believe in and push for the ideas that you think will have the greatest impact on people. And then once you get into power, obviously you have to deal with the situations that you have. And so you figure out what can get done. But you shouldn't limit your ideas based off of, Mitch McConnell being in the Senate.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, you could have a conversation about what legal authority does the Secretary of Education have, and could she do X or could she do Y? But I want to underscore an important point that Daniela made, which is, at the end of this year, we will know who the next president is, but we also will know something about which ideas were assets on the campaign trail and which ones were losers. And so there's a competition among candidates happening right now, but there's also a competition among policy ideas. And there will be a verdict on which of these ideas are seen as political winners and which ones are not. And even if there is not a majority for free community college or free 4-year university in January 2021, you will see over time more politicians aligning themselves with ideas that are seen as political winners. And so, you can see that, for example, on, the healthcare plan that Barack Obama ran on in 2008 was seen as one of the reasons that people voted for him, and that was enacted quickly. The healthcare plan that Governor Romney ran on in 2012 was seen as one of the reasons he lost, and that idea of voucherizing Medicare was previously a very popular Republican idea. They haven't talked about it a lot in the last 6 years. So I think there is a part of this that is really kind of democracy working.
Yeah. And in this conversation of candidates competing, there's been actually a really interesting thing that's been happening with historically black colleges in this election, where you have, one candidate says, I have $30 billion extra dollars for HBCUs. Another candidate has $40 billion. Another candidate has 50. One candidate has 100. But within that competition is kind of this acknowledgement that there needs to be a racial component to this, that there's a racial disparity in higher education that needs to be addressed, and they are planning to address it through historically black colleges. So I guess in the candidates' plans, how have you seen that kind of being a different thing this year, kind of compared to previous campaigns?
Well, I think the fact that they're willing to put large dollar numbers behind how much support they're going to give to HBCUs, I think that is great. I do want to just say that, the racial wealth gap and racial disparities that exist in higher education, like just putting money into HBCUs is definitely not going to be enough. It is a tool in a very large toolbox, but you have to also look at the quality of degrees that people are getting, the amount of debt that people are graduating with, the type of jobs that they're getting, not just HBCUs, but the other certificate programs and things that people are, especially African Americans, are acquiring so much debt in. So I want to hear more from candidates about not just the amount of money they're going to put into HBCUs, which I think is really good and important to do, but how they plan to tackle this overall issue with the disparity in higher ed when it comes to race.
Well, why don't you, I guess I want to hear what you have to say.
The reason why, and this promises it's not a plug for my book, but I'm working on a book right now that deals with racial inequality in higher education. But kind of to your point, black students right now are more likely to take on debt. They're more likely to take on more debt, and they're more likely to default on that debt after they take it on. And that's not a issue that just kind of happened by happenstance, but it's rather structural that goes back to, you know, the genesis of the higher education system as we've seen it now, and then at these individual inflection points where state and federal governments have done things for some students and not done those things for students of color. But within that, do you think that there's, I know you mentioned that it's not just HBCUs. So what could it be? Is it investing more resources into those institutions that Black students are attending that, or minority students are attending that aren't HBCUs? So say in Mississippi, it's not just Alcorn State or Mississippi Valley State, but it's also Delta State.
Yeah, I do think student debt is a great example of a policy that is racially neutral but has disparate impacts. And because Black students have less wealth, they're less likely to graduate, they're less likely to have labor market success if they do graduate. So, the impact of student debt by race is just staggering. There was an economist at Columbia who projected that 70% of Black borrowers would eventually default on their student loans. I think that it's difficult to find a fully satisfying answer because the federal government is supposed to have race-neutral policies, but I do think it is fundamentally a question of thinking about our heavy reliance on debt and whether we are using student loans too much to try and equalize opportunity. I think it is important to hold accountable those colleges that produce disproportionate amounts of student loan default, enroll disproportionate amounts of students of color. Many of those schools are for-profit colleges. And then I think the stuff on the student loan repayment is important too. And when we are talking about making student loans affordable, are we giving relief to the largest loans, which tend to be people who went to graduate professional school and also have high incomes? Or are we giving relief to people who may have smaller loans but are stuck in poverty and are most likely to default?
Actually, on that point of people who have gone to graduate and professional school, people who are lawyers and doctors, there's this question right now of whether or not programs like debt-free college, tuition-free college should be means tested, right? Should we cap it at 150,000? Should we cap it at 100,000? Should everyone be eligible for these kind of programs? I guess what is the fundamental divide there? Is it just some people believe in these kind of universal programs, or I guess what is the fundamental divide there?
I think it's hard for people to wrap their minds around the idea of someone who has very high earning potential, that they shouldn't have to pay back any of their loans. That someone who's going to be a doctor, it's going to be much easier, in quotes, because I have a couple friends who are doctors who are still paying off their loans, for them to pay it off than somebody else. And so I understand the argument for having it means tested at a higher level. Now, that's not to say that all doctors, when they graduate, are actually making a lot of money, because maybe they're working at a rural hospital, or maybe it's a public defenders don't make a lot of money, and their services are crucial. And so I think it's not as easy as just saying we should do this or we should do this, but I think there has to be a way to look at what exact fields people are going in, like what exactly their earning potential is, depending on what they do after college, and then make a decision then.
I think it's like a really interesting entry point into the question of what is progressive. Because for the course of my career, just getting up there now, the idea of being progressive has been like, how much of this money goes to low-income people? And so you'd sort of print out a table and be like, is enough of these dollars going to people below $40,000? And that was thought to be the most progressive way of looking at the question. And in this race, you have something different where the candidates perceived as more moderate are saying, we want to channel our higher percentage of dollars to low income. And the candidates who are seen as most progressive are saying, we want this to be truly universal. We want to bring everybody into a high quality public system. And to me, that's really drawing back further to Social Security, public libraries, free and public high schools, a tradition of progressivism that we had 100 years ago, but we've more recently been constrained by the idea that we didn't have enough money to do all of those things, so we really want to make sure we focus the dollars where they do the most good. That's like a really interesting debate, and I think it could be a turning point in what Democrats are fighting for across a range of social policy issues.
One significant knock on tuition and debt-free college, where it's like the federal government is going to be feeding more money into probably, if you did a federal-state partnership, if you did kind of any of these different forms, the federal government or state governments would just be feeding more money into colleges and universities. And oftentimes conservatives say that, well, wouldn't that just encourage colleges to increase their costs because they know that the government's going to be footing the bill for it. So I guess what's the response to that?
I'm going to look at the policy guy for that one.
Oh. Well, actually, I mean, I think that my concern is more on the other side, where you would have the federal government saying, like, poof, college is free, but that means you get, $8,000 per student or something like that. And then over time, those dollars don't grow. Inflation happens, higher education cost happens. And so I think that there is a danger of the free college proposals introducing a form of rationing that could degrade the quality or even the number of seats at public colleges and universities. So that's something I worry about.
And who gets left out in that situation?
Who always gets left out in that situation?
Right.
And actually, to that point, if you have a system where you make the kind of most exclusive institutions in the state more attractive to students who may have otherwise gone to private colleges, what does that do to the institutions that are your public regionals, the community colleges, places that have traditionally educated lower income minority students that have also received fewer resources? I guess what happens to those institutions in that setting?
It definitely is a danger that you would have more, if you made all public universities free, but didn't do anything for the nonprofit universities, you could have more of the most competitive students moving into the public system, and that would sort of bump students down to the regional publics. And I don't think it is fully appreciated the disparities that exist within our public higher education system, where we overwhelmingly send low-income students and students of color to community colleges or to the more regional universities and give them substantially less funding, and they have much lower graduation rates. That's a reason that our national higher ed graduation rate is about 60%. And when you combine that with debt, you're talking about not just wasting time, but really digging yourself into a hole.
Yeah. And I think it should be pointed out that kind of nationally, it's not rare to see a public flagship institution with 3, 4, 5, 6% black enrollment, even if you have a state that has 15 to 20% black population. So back to this question of kind of quality of degrees. There are a lot of candidates who are really bullish on for-profit colleges. Some suggesting that we shouldn't provide them with any funds. I guess where did kind of this passion towards kind of policing or accountability for-profit institutions come from?
From the data, right? Like they saw the outcomes and they saw what was happening. These schools are exceedingly expensive. They tend to attract students who need to borrow more money to attend them. A lot of these students drop out before they even get their degrees. And then their degrees, I don't want to say they are worth less than other degrees, but for some of these programs, they make them seem very appealing, that if you take a 2-year private certificate program, you're going to get like thousands of more dollars in your career. And they had no way to back that up, and they weren't backing it up. And I think the great work of the Obama administration really peeling back the layers there and calling these schools for what they were doing. So I think people now are talking about it because they were driven by the facts of what was happening on the ground. And it's sad to see a lot of the good things that happened under Obama's Department of Education being completely rolled back by our current Secretary of Education.
You sometimes hear people say it's just a question of tax status. They're like other universities. It shouldn't matter that they're run for profit. But they're really kind of quite distinct creatures in our system. So other types of colleges and universities are subject to a lot of oversight by states. UNH, other types of public universities have publicly elected boards. A lot of governance that's created by states. Nonprofits are subject to charity law and oversight by attorneys general and tax agencies. For-profits are basically federally funded. Their principal source of funding is student loans and Pell Grants. So another word for them could be federal colleges. They're creations of the federal student aid program, and they're not subject to this level of accountability. And the challenge is that the federal student aid program basically pays for-profit colleges to enroll students. And so that's what they do. They enroll a lot of students, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they get good outcomes for those students.
And there are a lot of public and private nonprofit colleges that also have, say, low graduation rates, may have low outcomes for students. Should they also be kind of subject to, maybe enhanced kind of monitoring by federal governments? Or
As a non-policy person up here, I would think so, right? Because what's most important, especially if you're talking about further investment from the federal government, is you have to look at those outcomes. So to me, it wouldn't matter if you're a for-profit or nonprofit. If you are basically a degree factory, or not even a degree factory because people aren't graduating, you're just taking in people and taking in their debt and burdening with that, then we should be able to look at that.
I agree with that, but I don't think they necessarily have to be treated identically. You may want different strategies for different kinds of colleges. So you wouldn't want any college that is routinely leaving students with debts they can't afford to repay. So you would want to do something to make sure that you weren't just sending in more students to take out more loans, to go into default and dig themselves into a deep hole. That doesn't necessarily mean that you would have the same remedy. So, if you wanted to close a cosmetology school, the people that might have gone there would find a better option in their community. If you wanted to close a community college, you're taking away educational opportunity from a whole section of the state. So you need to think a little bit differently about these problems.
So the Great Recession kind of urged on the student debt crisis by, there was a flood of students into higher education. Typically they couldn't afford that higher education. They're taking out more loans, which is kind of one of the things that led to this policy push on trying to address higher ed. I guess, first, does this attention to higher education, is this something that's going to mean something to voters? Is a higher education policy, as much attention has been focused on it, is that something that means something to voters?
Yeah, I think it will. I mean, obviously, I think it'll matter to a group of voters, but like I said earlier, I think it's a growing group of voters. There are people who are my age, and I won't say how old I am, but you can guess, who are still paying off student loans. There are people who are also my age who have college-age kids who are thinking of, her kids are about to enter college, and so they're thinking about this. But also, they're just people who are thinking about the workforce and what this means to, if you want to have a thriving workforce where people can graduate from college and do the work that is meaningful and important to them, if you are saddled with hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt or tens of thousands of dollars of debt, that's going to change potentially the trajectory of your career and what you're doing. So I think it may not be an issue like healthcare that gets a lot of attention, but it is very salient to a huge group of people.
One thing that I think is interesting is the question of once you start, where do you stop? So, 4 years ago, you had some candidates running on free college, and you had a lot of people who just left college saying like, well, what about me? I have all these loans. And, and they did have a point. So now you have candidates saying, okay, we're going to cancel some of that debt or all of that debt. And you have people saying, well, what about me? I worked my way through college, or I just finished paying off my loans. And so the question of what is fair in terms of fixing this problem going forward is one that there's a lot of debate about.
Yeah. And that's, of course, the debt cancellation is kind of on a spectrum between income-driven repayment, your debt gets canceled at the end of 20 years, to public service loan forgiveness, where after 10 years of working public service, to kind of means-tested debt forgiveness, to universal debt cancellation. But in that broader conversation, if you were to cancel debt as a one-time thing, I guess what happens to the students who might end up taking on debt after that one-time debt cancellation?
Yeah, it's a great question.
Right. There has to be other reforms that come, like that, again, that's not the panacea, that's not gonna solve the entire problem, right?
And one thing that's kind of like some of these plans are not fully aligned on that point. So the idea that you would, for example, discharge all student debt, but only make undergraduate education free. So that means, the next day, 40% of debt is taken out for graduate school. So next semester, you'll be running up debt again. Are we going to be forgiving all of that debt and essentially turning the federal loan program into a federal scholarship program? Or, how is that? What is the vision here for who should be paying, and how do we, that doesn't seem to be fully coherently articulated by any of the candidates yet.
Yeah. And earlier in this conversation, there was mention of kind of the way that we look at K-12, right? Where K-12 is free for anyone who wants to go to a public K-12 institution. Higher education isn't necessarily seen like that anymore. In 1862, when you had the Morrill Act, the federal government was like, we want to essentially send people to college for free. We want to educate more people. They will work on campus, but we want to educate more people. And there are colleges that currently do a form of that model. Berea College in Kentucky being one of those models. Do you think that's something that practically, beyond say Tennessee, where they can see the immediate economic benefit to the state, do you think that that's practically saying we are trying to educate a future workforce, and that is the national responsibility? Is that something that would convince people if you look at Tennessee and what it's done for the economy there?
I think it could, and I think what's happening in Tennessee is really incredible. And I think for people, especially those who have this view of college-educated folks being off somewhere in an ivory tower, they have to see the benefit to their community. So if you can point to a Tennessee, if you can point to other states that are doing interesting things when it comes to higher ed and how they're making it more accessible to everyone, where it's not just seen as something that those kids do and those other people are going to, and I don't want to subsidize those other people, I think that's how you can start to have success. People have to be able to see themselves and their own families in whatever vision you're trying to articulate for the country or for a particular state.
And we haven't necessarily addressed the question of private colleges in this whole, and kind of the free college and debt-free college situation. What becomes the role of the private college if public college or public community colleges is tuition or debt-free?
It's a really interesting question. And again, 3/4 of students go to public colleges or universities. So when you're talking about college affordability broadly, you are talking about principally public colleges and universities. Now, it's a little less true in New England than in other parts of the country. I think that how these free college plans will be designed around private colleges is a really important question. Some plans leave them out entirely, and that's going to be a real challenge. If you set aside the handful of private colleges that have really big endowments and we'll be here for millennia probably, a lot of other private colleges are really teetering and finding that their model is expensive. And if students are drawn into public universities, I think that's a real threat to them. The other option would be to extend to them the same resources and say, we're going to give public universities $5,000 per student. We'll give private universities the same deal, but once that happens, you're sort of drawn into the same governmental system of accountability. There'll be expectations about taking transfer students and how affordable those colleges are, and so those colleges will become less private over time, I think. So that's like a really interesting dilemma if free college happens.
Is that something that would or could possibly sway some conservatives to say that if we do this, if we allow private colleges to opt in, but with some kind of safeguards, and that could potentially bring down the cost of college, is that something that could sway Republicans to say that, okay, yes, I'm on board for that? Politically, is that a winning?
I don't know, maybe.
Oh, sorry.
Are you more optimistic than I am?
Well, I'm really interested to hear what Governor Weld has to say about this, because at the federal level, Republicans are against all of this. Now, it's part of Governor Weld's campaign platform, And again, it is, it's a bipartisan idea at the state level. So I will be interested to hear him talk about why he chose to make that part of a platform and the reception he's getting when he talks to Republican audiences.
So right now, and for the last several years, higher education reporters on Capitol Hill have been covering the Higher Education Act reauthorization, which is basically the federal bill that governs higher education for the most part. And one of the big things in that is college affordability. Is there anything on the horizon that might address that would be separate from these candidates that could move?
The types of game-changing investments that we make in social policy are almost always because a president campaigned on it and won and decided to expend their mandate that way. So something like hundreds of billions of dollars being spent to make college free is probably only going to happen if one of these candidates win. I think there's a lot that Congress can do even without presidential leadership. So there are currently 8 repayment plans, some of which sound virtually identical. Even experts can't tell them apart. There's dozens of different ways to pause payments on your loans if you have temporary economic problems. And that makes it really challenging for students to navigate and get the assistance that they need. The application process is extremely complicated. It's more complicated than filing your taxes. You could imagine greatly reducing, there's tons of questions on there that have virtually no impact on how much financial aid you get, like did you get any untaxed income because you were working as a clergy member, stuff like that. So those kinds of things you could imagine members of Congress cleaning up. And I think that stuff can be quite important. It won't be kitchen table conversation, but it can be the kind of thing that does have a big impact on students' access to student aid. They just sort of will never know that actually happened. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you mentioned so in 2015 when President Obama came out with his tuition-free community college plan, now most of the candidates essentially say that yes, a 2-year community college free plan is the way to go. But at the time, it was still kind of a touch and go. How do you get in 5 years? Because I mean, it's actually a pretty radical stretch of time. How do you get from there to there in 5 years?
I mean, it helps to have President Obama push the issue. But I think, again, it goes to it being a salient issue for so many people who are dealing with it and can understand very easily the benefit of making 2-year, it's not a hard stretch to say 2-year community college, okay, yes, that could be free. I think when you start moving to 4-year, and that's where you start maybe losing some people, but I think it's because so many folks understand the importance of getting higher education and the economic barriers to doing so, and the messenger matters, and President Obama and everyone in his administration, I think, did a really good job of explaining not only why it's good to do, but what the economic benefits are to the nation to do that.
I was working in the Obama administration at that time, and it was immediately obvious that idea just had some kind of grab on people. It just sort of blew up immediately, and I think, and that's especially unusual because it was obviously not going to happen with a Republican Congress. And so normally when you sort of have a blue sky proposal that has no legislative viability, it gets discounted pretty quickly by the press. And I don't know, I do think that in part the idea was quite simple. So if you just say free community college, people knew what he was talking about. If you say double Pell Grants, a lot of people are like, well, what's a Pell Grant and how big is it and how much is college going to cost after you double it? It's just a much more complicated concept. And then I do believe that there's something about the fundamentals of what people are experiencing that informs the policy agenda. Not to be unduly optimistic, but there's something about a democracy, I think, that does matter.
So I think, are we going to open up the floor for questions for the panel? I believe there are going to be microphones coming around. I saw the hand here first. We'll have a microphone coming up.
Thank you. Appreciate you all's work.
Should be on.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Great.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Okay, so a lot of discussion about the cost, but no discussion about the productivity of the systems, or I didn't see it or hear it. First place, K-12 gets about 1 in 3 kids ready for post-secondary education. The other 65% are not ready, yet many of them go on. So 2 questions. One is, should the community colleges in particular and the 4-year in general have higher standards for entry to produce a higher graduation rate and less totally wasted debt? And should the schools themselves be much more focused on graduation as opposed to making the faculty happy through mentoring and many other programs which have shown some great success in certain black college in Alabama, I can't remember the name of it, I think it's in Alabama or Georgia, has just done great on graduation rates for minorities. Yeah. So why isn't it that the schools aren't held more accountable for their productivity, and why shouldn't they raise standards to see that only kids who have at least a reasonable opportunity or possibility of graduation are allowed to enter?
So should there be more kind of quality control in terms of graduation rates for these institutions?
I think it's a great question. I think what is exciting about higher ed right now is that we're learning a lot about what we can do to help students succeed at much higher rates. And even students who, for example, City University of New York enrolled a bunch of low-income students, many students of color, not prepared for college-level work. And they said, we're going to put you in a special program. It's going to be a cohort. You have to go to college full-time. We're going to put you directly into college-level work with academic support. We're going to waive tuition. And this program doubled graduation rates. So, it's going from 25% to 50%, so we've got a long way to go. But we have emerging evidence that we can help many more students succeed. And I think there's a lot of examples like that. Higher ed is really good at being innovative. What it's not good at is trying to learn those lessons and apply them systemically. So I think that is the problem with our system, is saying, here's a program on a corner of a campus, we know it works, how do we apply that across the school, across the state?
Should the schools have higher standards for entry?
I think that it is a really fundamental part of our system that community colleges and universities are open to everyone, and there's something very American about that. And I do believe that we are learning a lot more about how to help students with academic challenges succeed. Now, if you're talking about someone who's many grade levels below college level, that's different. But for many of these students, you can go a long way with 8th grade math. Students are pretty close, and they're at a high school level in English. There are post-secondary degrees that those students can succeed in if we do the things that we know work.
So we have a question here.
Hi, can we or should we roll in universal 4K with a universal community college?
Universal, what was it?
Pre-K.
Universal 4K, or starting kindergarten at fourth,
Okay.
4-year-olds.
Well, as someone whose child is about to enter universal pre-K 3 in Washington, D.C., I think these programs are excellent. They have been proven to increase outcomes throughout a child's life. Our organization has done a lot of work, especially looking at what's been happening in D.C. and other places where there's universal pre-K 4. I don't know how you would necessarily marry the two, but I think as a standalone policy, pre-K 3, pre-K 4 is something that all states and localities should be looking into.
I mean, did you want to weigh in?
Well, I was going to say one of the interesting things is that kind of before you end up getting a 2-year, President Obama giving a speech about free 2-year community college, you have the Kalamazoo Promise, you have kind of this whole range of kind of beta tests in different communities. So I think if that were to be a thing that happened, it would seem that it would have to start at a city level. Say San Antonio, for example, may do free pre-K and also do free at its community college district. So I think it would have to be something that was beta tested at a community level before it would be kind of exacerbated into larger. I don't know if you would disagree there.
No, I agree. I mean, I think some of the strongest evidence about the benefits of spending, of investment, is in young children. So you could make a case that you should do preschool before you do free college. I think there is a challenge in that the need there is so vast that even if you were talking about enrolling every 4-year-old in preschool 6 hours a day, that would be extremely expensive, not really a child care solution, arguably not as beneficial as investing in infants and babies, but not even a child care solution for 4-year-olds really. So I think that it's just such a huge problem that I think that our leaders have had a hard time articulating a chunk that could be bitten off in a feasible way and make a real difference.
We may have a question here.
Hello. So I don't remember the man's name, but there was a librarian who worked at UNH years ago. I think he died in 2014. And in his will, he donated $4 million of his own savings to the university. And it later became a scandal that the university used over $1 million of that for a new scoreboard for the football field. So my question is, if a free tuition public college plan goes through, what sort of policy could be put in place to assure that the university uses the funds they are given in an adequate manner?
Well, there needs to be one, right? So I don't know that, I haven't read these plans all down to the last letter, and so I don't know what kind of accountability measures are in here, but obviously whenever you're dealing with federal government dollars, there has to be some accountability on how that money is spent.
I think it is, I think it's really an interesting challenge because when you think about it from a policy perspective, we're like, we want our colleges to be inclusive and affordable and high in quality, right? Like, I would say that's what we want our colleges to be. But then when you're looking at, a place like UNH, it's so much more than that. It's a source of local pride, a source of economic development, a source of research. It's a lifelong affiliation. It has its own police department. I mean, it's a full-on community, and so how do you balance the need to prioritize the kind of education we wanted to offer with the other aspects of university life that has made it such a durable institution?
Okay. Do we have a question here?
Thank you for the panel. This is really interesting. My name is Carrie Moorhead. I'm the Dean of the Graduate School here. So just to put that in the context to my question, graduate school very rarely gets mentioned when we finally get education on the agenda at all. It's generally that we're looking at undergraduate education. So I was really pleased to hear you mention graduate education. I'd like to know, again, for context, 1/3 of the graduate students here at UNH have an undergrad degree from UNH. And many of them would stay on in fields where it makes sense for them to do so. For example, occupational therapists who come in, or communication scientists and disorder students would stay on for that 5th year because their profession requires that. So one of the areas that there's discussion around now is the risk of getting in the weeds, Pell Grant eligibility. If you have any left, that it would go to graduate school. I'd be interested in knowing whether you think that really has legs, and also if you'd like to speak a little bit more about education at the graduate level and how we fund or are not funding that right now.
It is true that among federal policymakers, people have thought about the undergrad degree as the first priority and graduate degree as sort of something extra on top. I think that the way that a lot of graduate school gets funded, of course, is through student debt. And the size of loans that you can take out for graduate school is really quite large. And it is a growing source of the federal loan portfolio. I think it's going to be a growing area of concern over time. The policy proposals that seem more to have a little more traction than Pell Grants for graduate schools is around how do you identify those graduate students who are going into low-paid professions, whether they're teachers, where today the average teacher has $55,000 in debt from graduate school, or social workers or public interest lawyers, and how do you have a targeted loan relief program for those types of professions.
All right. Do we have any more questions?
I'll
You have one right up front.
Which is, this has sort of been touched on a little bit, but in the pre-K context, and there were a couple other mentions. But one question is, so taking the point that it's not this magic bullet, you have a college education, you end up rich so you can pay off your student loan. But nevertheless, on average, overall, people with college educations are better off and are better able to absorb the costs ultimately of their college education. So how do you sort of think about, given all the other needs with people who are not getting college educations and everything that other kinds of help, other kinds of investments you make in society, how do you sort of weigh the importance of these investments, especially at the biggest level, free college and the most expensive end of it? How do you weigh those against sort of other needs and other population and the needs of other populations?
I would say, to me, there is a student debt crisis among the million students a year who are defaulting on their loans. And when you have an average college graduation rate of 60%, lower at a lot of places, of course, that's what an average is, and you're financing that with debt, that's a really toxic combination. And so when you have 1 million people defaulting a year, 70% of black borrowers eventually defaulting, that is a crisis. Those people are digging themselves in a hole. And I think you should think about, like my mental picture is a single mother, she's in her late 20s, she's working full-time to support her kids, she's trying to go back at school to get a better job. She takes out a loan to go to community college or a for-profit college and finds that she's left, that was like the worst mistake of her life. That to me is like a very high priority to fix. I think when you're talking about a 4-year college graduate with $30,000 in debt, we see signs that those students, their lives are affected by student debt. They make different career choices. They delay home ownership. It can affect family formation. I don't think it is a great idea to start young people with this debt hanging over them at the very beginning of their lives. But I do think it is important to think about that as a bit of a different problem.
We've actually been talking a lot about young people going to college, kind of the high school graduate going into college, but I guess what are the candidates saying about the person who maybe started college and stopped out and then they're 38 years old or they're 40 years old and they want to go back to college? How are candidates making pathways for that student?
Some of them are. So you do hear some of the candidates talking more specifically about technical training programs, in some cases online training programs. Out in the real world, there's a big effort to give people credit for what they've already learned. I haven't heard candidates talk about that. So that is an important path. But again, it's interrelated with this whole, because one of the consequences of defaulting on your student loan is you can't get another student loan. I guess I can see the logic there, but you end up then with these huge debts and your only path to economic opportunity and a better job is cut off.
So I'll just jump in with a scheduling update. So Representative Gabbard was supposed to be speaking right now. We don't know where she is. If she comes, we'll put her on stage. But we're still, Mr. Yang is still expected at 5. So I think we'll just, we can go on with this for a few more minutes and play it by ear.
All right. So we have more question. You got a microphone. Oh, we have a microphone coming for you.
To what extent, if at all, has more generous, liberal loan policies over the past 20 years where more higher amounts of debt are made available to students contributed to tuition increases in universities because they know there's a larger pool of money on that side, and then creating a synergistic effect, then again, more loans, higher tuition, a synergy going in the wrong direction.
At the undergraduate level, researchers haven't found that relationship, and that makes sense. The loan limit's something like $5,000 a year, $30,000 over a career. That is much lower than cost of going to college anyway. At the graduate level, students can be allowed to borrow up to the full cost of tuition fees, room and board. And in that case, it may be different, but I'm not aware of any academic research establishing a relationship there.
But it's definitely an argument, right, that you hear as to why we shouldn't allow people to borrow more money.
Just seems in the past, debt was smaller amounts. Obviously, seeing go up.
Yeah, I guess, well, to that point, what is the cause of the rapid rise in debt? How does it go from, it's a couple billion here to now it's, 100 billion to 200 billion, 300 billion, and now we're in the trillions. How does it so quickly rise?
Well, it's true that the total amount of federal student debt is now $1.5 trillion. 10 years ago, it was 600 billion. So that's between 2 and 3 time increase over a decade. And a big factor is more students are borrowing, and they are borrowing more. In part, that's because of the Great Recession, which cut state support and increased tuition. College costs continue to rise faster than family incomes. And it's also true that we have a lot of students who aren't repaying the loans like we might have expected. And so there are a lot of loan balances that are outstanding for 10, 20, 30 years. So while new loans are going out, they're not necessarily getting paid back at the same rate.
We have a question there and then a question one in.
I may have missed part of this, but when I was going to school, my understanding is that the grants that were given out were about 80% of the support, and it was about 20% loans, and that now it's about 80% loans and 20% grants. How much does that play into, and I went to undergrad 25, 30 years ago, so I'm just curious how much that is playing into this whole factor.
It is definitely a big part of it. The Pell Grant used to, in the 70s, cover 3/4 of the tuition fees, room and board at a public university, and it now covers about 1/4. So it's 1/3 of the purchasing power that it used to have.
What percentage of the 1.5 trillion is interest, and what percentage is principal?
I would really hope Mr. Yang gets here soon. It's an interesting, there's a growing, it is becoming a less, how do I say this? More and more loans are in this income-driven repayment plan. So we now have close to 8 million people making payments, not the same amount every month in a mortgage style, but instead on a sliding scale based upon their earnings. And many of those students find that the payments that's required by that formula is not enough to cover interest. And so their payments grow over time. Now, the theory is you make your affordable payment every month, and after 10 years, if you're in public service, after 20 years for everyone else, the balance is forgiven. And so if that system is working, the concept of interest is maybe a little less relevant, because as long as you are paying the amount that is considered affordable, you may never have to pay off the loan in full.
But I was more curious about the question. 1.5 trillion is a lot of money. If the majority of it is interest that's built up on loans, that's a little different than if it's principal, it's the money that was actually borrowed. That speaks to what the interest rates are and what the loan officers are getting. And I just wondered what the breakdown was on that body of money.
I don't know, obviously, but another way of maybe getting at what you're asking is, are taxpayers getting their money back? And the budget projections year after year show these loans are very close to breaking even, a couple percentage points on either side. So the programs are being basically run at cost. The interest rate is a reflection of what the government wants to recoup its costs. Now, should the student loan programs be run at cost? I think you could have a debate about that. But on the whole, the government is not losing money on these loans as far as the best economists think.
And I actually had a question off of that. So when you're looking at debt forgiveness after 10 years or debt forgiveness after 20 years or even debt cancellation right now, what happens to, because how does the IRS treat that money? So say you have $80,000 in loans, you've made payments on it for 10 years, and you're in PSLF, that debt is forgiven. That maybe 40, 50,000, however much you had left, is forgiven. Does the IRS treat that as income, or is that something that drops off and they don't treat as income? And then kind of the same thing with income-driven repayment.
It's a great question because the answer is different. And in general, as a matter of tax law, forgiven debt is considered income. So as a general principle, that if you owe me $100 and I say you don't have to pay me back, that's considered $100 in income. They have made exceptions for public service loan forgiveness, that's tax-free. They made exceptions for loans that are discharged because the student becomes disabled or dies, that's tax-free. They haven't made an exception for some of these other categories of loan forgiveness. If your school defrauds you, that's taxable. If you make payments for 20 years under an income-driven plan, that's taxable. So there's a real inconsistency here, and that is, I think, a challenge for the people who want debt cancellation plans. You're not just talking about asking the Department of Education to change its policies, but you also have to make a pretty big change to the tax code, assuming you don't want students to have to pay taxes on their canceled student loans.
So we have a question here.
Hi, this is a very complicated, I can see how complicated this is, but shouldn't we be focusing on the cost of college when we're looking at $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year for tuition? We're looking at debt forgiveness and free college, but why are the costs so high? What's being done to look at how to bring that down?
So, I guess first, just kind of looking at the broad sweep of higher education, most colleges are going to be less than, if you're looking at private or public colleges, most of those are going to run in between 20 and, or if you're looking at certain public colleges, so say flagships, for example, those are going to run about $20,000 per year for tuition, so $10,000 per semester. But it's a very good question. Just generally looking at private colleges, looking at even some public colleges that are growing more expensive. What is driving that?
Yeah, James, what's driving?
It's not a simple question. It's one that's been studied a lot. Economists like to talk about the fact that as our economy as a whole is getting more productive, it still takes one professor to teach a seminar of 18 students. And so that act of instruction is so intensive that you don't see the same types of productivity gains. You would feel like you lost something if you made that seminar more productive by increasing the size. I think that probably is a factor. I think that part of the answer is that college is worth it, and you still see very large earnings gains from going to colleges, especially the most selective colleges. You're much less likely to be unemployed, and so at least historically, there hasn't been a real demand from students to bring those costs down because it's still worth it to go there. Now, that's starting to change, and if you look at a lot of the private non-selective colleges, their tuition is still going up, but over the last couple of years, they've had to put all that money back into scholarships. So their actual revenue from tuition minus scholarships has been flat, and that's one of the reasons why you've seen some college closures in Vermont, and a lot of those liberal arts colleges are under a lot of pressure.
So what do you say to the conservative argument that the reason why college is so expensive is because you have all these professors who are tenured and they demand all these things, and isn't that the reason why tuition's so high, James?
I don't think you would find, as a whole, I think professors work pretty hard. And I don't think that is the main source of the problem. Yeah.
Is the sticker price something that is scaring a lot of people in terms of higher education, right? Where you look at college and you say, okay, I just got this thing that said it's going to be $30-something thousand a year, where you may be receiving $5,000 for your Pell Grant, you may be receiving a scholarship that pays you $10,000, and maybe they're covering books. So it ends up looking a little bit less. Do you think that sticker price, that sticker shock, is something that is one, politically saying, look, why is that sticker price so high? The colleges need to bring it down. But also on a personal level, for people looking at that, is that something that is scaring people off?
Absolutely. I mean, I have friends who are sending their kids to school and their tuition is $50,000 a year. And I'm, how do you do that? I was like, I know where you work, I know what you make, and they're mortgaging their lives to send their kids to college. They made a cost-benefit analysis that it was worth it for their kid to do that. But I think a lot of families they look at that and they say, I don't know that this is worth it. I don't know, and $50,000 obviously is very egregious, but $20,000 is a lot of money to send somebody to college. And if you are working a minimum wage job or a barely above minimum wage, these numbers can be completely daunting. I went to the University of Virginia, go Hoos, and when I went, I was an out-of-state student, and my tuition was $18,000 a year, and it was hard. It was really, really hard. Out-of-state tuition now for UVA is over $50,000. I'm like, who can afford that? I mean, obviously people are affording it somehow, but yeah, I think that is a challenge. So your question about what are we doing about college affordability, or what story are we telling about why these investments are important and how we're gonna help families, it needs to be done. Because I'm thinking about my kid in a couple of years. You better hit those books and get an academic scholarship.
Is this the case for community colleges? Because most community colleges are going to be far less expensive than this. Is this the case to say, okay, you can do 2 years of community college at $2,000, $3,000 a semester, and then go to one of these four-year institutions if that's what you choose to do? Is this the essential case for?
It's true. Community colleges are a much more affordable option, and I think you could make a good case that we don't spend enough money on our community colleges. They overall have a 25% graduation rate. You have adjuncts teaching, 5 classes a semester. Students don't get access to good advising. And we have evidence that money spent well could make a big difference there on helping more students graduate and transfer to a four-year. So, and half of students go to a community college. So when you think about college costs too much, yes, that's true, especially at elite privates, elite publics. It's really not necessarily true at a community college. You can make a case they should cost more.
I had seen one more hand back here.
So, so this to James, I guess. I mean, what becomes our benchmark then for what the true cost of college either is or should be, right? You kind of mentioned this concern about a ratcheting effect, essentially, of, if government were to pay for this, there's a concern they're going to cap it, say, at $8,000 per pupil, and then they're going to slowly drive that down, right? It's not going to keep up with the true costs. How do we know what that true cost is? I know that's a tough question, but I mean, how do we get to what that cost is and what we should be spending on it to get the education that is high quality and accessible and all of the things that we're looking for?
Yeah, well, I would be looking at the results. Do we have a public system of higher education that is inclusive? The enrollment looks like the community of the state across the state and within each institution. Are students graduating? Are they finding jobs or going on to graduate school? Are they able to repay their loans? To me, when we ask students to take out loans to invest in themselves, we have an obligation to make sure that that investment is going to pay off and that they have a fair shot at graduating and accessing the reason that they're going to college, to access a job or a better life. And so that's what I would be looking at, is do we have the resources in place to accomplish that?
Yeah, since the productivity of the schools directly impacts the time, which in fact impacts the debt, how about if we funded colleges or public colleges based on outcomes? In other words, as they increase their outcomes, they are rewarded with more money, which is what they all want, is more money, obviously. So why not just have some market impact on their productivity by outcomes? I mean, currently, most of them are funded. They assemble kids in a classroom, they put somebody in front of the classroom, and on the 8th day of class, they get funded, and that's it. It doesn't matter if the class never meets again. They get their money from the state. So your comments on outcome-based funding?
I think it's worth considering. There are a lot of states who are experimenting with it now. I think that the evidence shows that it succeeds in the sense that it makes colleges focus more on completion, which is good. Has not yet succeeded in driving up completion rates. So, and in some cases, it does seem to exacerbate equity problems. So if you
So actually, one example. So in Kentucky, for example, they had switched to a performance-based funding model where, you know, one of the kind of baseline facts about higher education is that the inequality is kind of baked in. So the University of Kentucky, of course, is going to have more money in order to have more resources to spend on its students than, say, Morehead State or, say, Kentucky State. So when you switch to a performance-based funding model, even if you try to plug in some of those equity indicators, places like Morehead State or Kentucky State end up doing worse. So you have the HBCUs that end up having less resources the next year in order to try to do better when they were already provided with fewer resources to begin with.
Even on a percentage increase basis, then that would make up for that this year.
You,
because to go from 10% to 12% versus going from 50% to whatever it would be 60% is about equal or easier for the 10%.
you might think that there's a formula out there that would actually drive greater equity, and that's probably right. But my point is we haven't found it yet, and not even in other areas of social policy. When you look at healthcare or trying to reduce prison recidivism, across the whole range of trying to pay people for outcomes, you have seen whoever it is that's getting the payment is trying to serve the easier to serve, and we haven't solved it yet.
So James, Daniela, thank you so much for a fantastic conversation, and thank you all for your questions.
We're expecting Mr. Yang any minute now, but you know, if you want to stretch your legs for a minute, that's cool too. And thank you again to the panel for extending in the absence of Representative Gabbard.
That's weird. I hope she's okay. How many people on that section?
This is like all
Still
the
no
unit.
Well, she didn't even show up. She came last time.
Oh, really? I thought he was still. Oh, well then.
He may have been before.
Yeah, I withdraw my sympathy.
Well, no, he's not late.
Oh.
Gabbard.
It happens to all of us. But I'm still annoyed.
That was nice.
Yeah.
I want to say hi. Yeah.
Hi. She's in charge of productive conversation.
Nice, in and out a little bit. We have a communications class and we're doing research on what y'all are saying. We're doing a WA in March or April, I think. It was really,
It's better than restart. Quick was a little panic. Right. James Carr just pulled into spot. All right. Oh, wait, we got hey, James. Wait, we gotta scrap it all.
There's water up here for
Great.
if they
Okay.
want them.
Great.
I thought about that before.
Michael, you wanted to move this?
All right, so we are about to get started once again with our first presidential candidate speaker. So presidential candidate Andrew Yang is an American entrepreneur and the founder of Venture for America. From 2000 to 2009, he worked in startups and early stage growth companies as either a founder or executive officer. In 2012, he was selected as a champion of change by the Obama administration, and in 2015, as a presidential ambassador for global entrepreneurship. We'd like to welcome Andrew Yang to the stage. Thanks so much. Very nice to meet you. Pretty good. I have a microphone for you over here.
Hello, everyone. So I'm going to stand here and address, and then we're going to sit down together? No.
Yes.
Is that the way it goes? All right, cool. Well, thank you for being here. College affordability is a massive problem. I'm trying to survey how many of y'all are students. Raise your hand if you're a student. Most of you. So you've noticed college affordability is a major problem. And those of you who aren't students, how many of you have kids who are in school or you hope to be in school someday, like me? If you're a parent like me, you look up and say, college costs what? Because when I went to college, it was expensive, but now, oh my gosh, it's just climbed up and up. It's gotten 250% more expensive since I went to school in the 90s. Has it gotten 2.5 times better? No, it hasn't really. So we have to try and get our arms around this problem as a country. And I went through the numbers trying to figure out why college has gotten so expensive. Is it because they hired lots more professors? No. Actually, there's something very strange going on in terms of professors, where they now have this endless supply of adjuncts that will never get tenure, that are in some kind of very, very strange subsistence labor arrangement, because you have PhDs getting produced every year, and they all dream about being professors, but you don't have any tenure track positions available, so they get put into this position where they're teaching classes very inexpensively, actually. So it's not professors. Is it because the colleges have built lots of new buildings and facilities? Not really, as it turns out. A little bit, but I went through the numbers and it's not that much. The other thing is that if you build buildings, you can get some rich person to put their name on it very often, because rich people like that. So if it's not those two things, then what is it? Number one, states have cut back aid. And number two, the administrator, non-faculty, the administrator to student ratio has gone up 150% as prices have gone up 250%. So those are the two big drivers. And as president, I want to try and address both of those. But we have to actually start even before someone is heading to college. So big picture, we have overprescribed college in this country, and we have underprescribed trade, technical, vocational, and apprenticeships. Only 6% of American high school students are in technical, trade, or apprenticeship programs right now. 6%. In Germany, that's 59%. Think about that gulf. And right now, too many kids are getting the message that it has to be college or nothing. And they have to know that there are all of these very, very lucrative, stable, enjoyable careers that are available for someone who goes into the trades. So as your president, I will team up with Mike Rowe of Dirty Jobs and go around saying, it's like, look, these are great jobs. And then we will invest at the highest levels in high schools who want to develop technical, trade, or apprenticeship programs for our kids. Then I would put $1,000 a month into the hands of every American starting at age 18, which if you want to go to college, great, it's partially paid for. If you want to do something independent, you can take a shot at that. We have to try and actually invest in our kids and our kids' futures directly. And then we have to work with colleges to try and get the cost down over time and forgive a significant chunk of the $1.6 trillion in student loan debt that's outstanding. Because right now, that $1.6 trillion, first, it was less than $100 billion in 1999. Think about that for a second. Went from less than $100 billion to $1.6 trillion in 20 years. And it's crushing the hopes of a future generation. Would you rather young people, no offense to you all, live in your parents' basements, paying off debt loads forever, or going out there, buying homes, starting families, even starting businesses? I mean, to me, that's a very easy choice. We should let you do the things that will move our country forward. We bailed out the banks for $4 trillion during the Wall Street financial crisis. We should have chosen homeowners. This time we have the same choice. We have $1.6 trillion in student loan debt. We have to choose our people. So I would forgive a significant chunk of the student loan debt that's outstanding to give you all a real shot at building the kind of future that you want and the country needs. So those are some of my very high-level thoughts on college affordability. We have to start making this work for you all, because we have left young people a total shambles. And this is something that colleges will not talk to you about, but there's a 40 to 44% chance after you graduate from college that you're going to do a job that does not require a college degree. If that happens, do you get a refund? No. Do your parents get a refund? No. And so what's happening with a lot of young people is we're loading you up with debt, sticking you in an uncertain job market that's not working for almost half of you, and then you're walking around with this debt load, this degree that's not actually commanding value in the market. So what's your next move? Go back to school, that's right. You see what we're doing to our young people? We've created this whole insecure ladder pretending it still works, and it doesn't work. And we have to make it work for you all. I will make it work for you all as your president. Thank you very much.
So, So we're going to open it up for Q&A and momentarily, but first I wanted to kind of, how's it going? First I wanted to ask you, so you were talking about kind of vocational education, and you've talked a lot about making that sort of education a more practical path and making it debt-free. One of the things that always kind of comes into question when you talk about vocational education is the idea of tracking, and the concern about, we don't want to send too many low-income or minority students or direct them away from a potentially higher paying career. How do you kind of address that question of tracking in this kind of configuration?
Well, a lot of it is around just creating options for our people at the high school level. There are a lot of kids in high school that already know that college might not be the right fit for them. And what are they being presented with right now as an alternative? Very, very little. So I don't think it's necessary that you, for example, require that someone go down one of these technical or vocational or trade programs at the high school level, but I do think it's immensely helpful for you to make it available. And then if a 9th or 10th grader says, you know what, I actually really like working with my hands. I like taking things apart and putting them back together. I don't really see myself in an office job. Then they actually have a real opportunity to explore that set of skills without necessarily the administration saying, hey, you belong here.
And one more question before we open it up to the audience. One of the very rare things that presidential candidates get asked, you mentioned earlier about adjunct professors. So what would a Yang administration kind of do to address kind of this adjunct crisis that we have right now?
Well, I think that there have been efforts among these adjuncts to unionize and try and actually collectively bargain for fair treatment. I think that that's one possible recourse because they are being systematically exploited right now. I think that having universities have to come up with some kind of better compensation model than right now in this on a per class, per credit basis that right now many of them are using. So nonprofits, I ran a nonprofit for 7 years. And nonprofits are capable of great things, but they're also capable of doing things and then sort of cloaking themselves and saying, hey, I'm a nonprofit, so I can't really do anything wrong. The fact is, if there was a for-profit business that was exploiting adjuncts the way that universities are exploiting adjuncts, we'd be having a very different conversation about it than because it's in the walls of a university. And so to me, having that kind of conversation with these universities that are receiving, frankly, billions of dollars in either direct government aid or tax exemption is a necessary conversation.
So we're going to open the floor up to questions. We have microphones that will be coming around. And so we have a question here, a microphone coming, then we have one.
Mr. Yang, can you show us your homework on the $1,000 a month for every adult American, how much it will cost, where the money will come from, what the net impact on the economy is, and show your work, please, sir, as a mathematician?
Yeah, I would love this. Thank you for the question. Where's my math hat? All right. So $1,000 a month for every American adult sounds like an awful lot. You're looking at maybe something around $2.6 trillion a year, because you're looking at the adult population. For context, the US economy is $21 trillion a year. So you look up and you say $2.6 trillion a year, that seems like an awful lot. Where do you get the money? The first place you get the money is you look at what's happening in the 21st century economy. Biggest winners are companies like Amazon, Facebook, Google, Apple, that are paying zero or near zero in taxes. Amazon, literally zero in taxes. Starbucks, zero. Netflix, zero. So if you put a mechanism in place where we're getting our tiny fair share of those companies' revenues that are coming in, then we can generate $800 billion to $1 trillion in revenue in year one with a big up arrow attached to it. Because right now, if you have something like artificial intelligence come out that displaces hundreds of thousands of call center workers or truck drivers, how much are we going to see of that in tax revenue right now? Zero, because it's going to be in the hands of one of the big tech companies that pay zero in taxes. So if you put a mechanism in place where we're getting a slice of that, we can get $800 billion to $1 trillion very quickly with a big up arrow attached. Now that's not $2.6 trillion, so where do you get the next 1.6? Here's where the magic is. After you all get $1,000 a month in your hands here in New Hampshire, where does that money go? How much of it stays right here in New Hampshire? Most all of it. Not all of it, and you might get your own Netflix password. But most of it would go to textbooks and pizza and car repairs you've been putting off and Little League signups and local nonprofits and religious organizations. That money flows through the New Hampshire economy multiple times and ends up generating economic growth between 8 to 10% economy-wide, creates more than 10,000 jobs here in the state, and generates 500 to 600 billion in new tax revenue for the country because your economy just grew by 8 to 10% sustainably. Now, the next piece is you save billions of dollars on things like incarceration, homelessness services, emergency room healthcare that we spend hundreds of billions on right now. It was a corrections officer here in New Hampshire who said we should pay people to stay out of jail because we spend so much more when they're in jail. We say we're being smart by not investing in people, but we end up spending much more when they hit our institutions because they're very, very expensive. Then the fourth thing is that if you put this money into our hands, we become stronger, healthier, mentally healthier, our graduation rates go up, our stress levels go down. And one study showed that you would increase GDP by $700 billion a year just on the basis of better health outcomes and better educational outcomes for our people. And this is before you take into account any increased entrepreneurship, creativity, risk-taking, all the positive things you would see if people felt like they actually had a foundation that was secure. So the trickle-up economy ends up paying for itself almost entirely after you get us our fair share of the Amazon sales, the Google searches, the Facebook ads, eventually the robot truck mile and the AI work units.
So we had a question right here. The microphone is its way.
Hi. Full disclosure, I'm a professor in the humanities. And my question is a little bit about your framing about the value of a college education. And, I think there's not a universal pathway for people, certainly in the trades as being an option. But is that the only value that we have of higher education now is the job as the measurement? Or are there not other concerns we have with kind of funneling people through particular channels and thinking that if I'm in the trades, I wouldn't benefit from a couple of years of humanities education at a community college? Or, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that, because that's the frame that we hear over and over again, but it really makes me worry.
I love this question so much, and I value the humanities very, very deeply. I showed up to college wanting to be an English major, and then washed out after a semester after reading like Mole Flanders or something. I was like, oh, I didn't know this is what English majors did. So then I went down another track. But I think what you're saying is exactly the right set of questions. And really the fundamental question is, what is an education for? And one of the problems we have in American life right now is that we put a dollar sign on everything. And so we say, look, the value of a college degree is the earnings potential you get after graduating from college. And that's true in part because we made college very expensive, and it's a very big burden on families. But originally, the purpose of a college education was not get a good job. It was originally moral education and education of essentially citizens in the religious and moral foundations of the society, sort of like a clergy light kind of training, just like the training of patricians and wannabe noble people, more or less. Now it's gone very, very far from that. And to me, this is where we have to progress and evolve to, is I do not think it is a good place for American education to look at humanities professors like yourself and say, hey, poetry, classics, English, all this stuff, valueless. Who cares about you? You know what we care about? Engineering, economics, like all the stuff that we think is going to be lucrative. Because the purpose of your institution is not necessarily just to make maximal earnings potential for all of your graduates. You have a higher purpose than that. You're a public institution. You're supposed to be educating the citizenry with like a capital E, like big E education. But right now that's gotten lost because we have put so much financial strain on our families. We've stripped financial support from the state university, so everyone's showing up expecting an ROI. And then humanities is under attack because the college looks at it and says, hey, you're not a moneymaker. You know what is a moneymaker? Them, et cetera, et cetera. And then parents send the same message to their kids. Don't study poetry, don't study humanities, it's a waste of time. Like, you need to go study something that's gonna make you money. The rough part about all this is that the things that you think of as making you a lot of money, like accounting, law, some forms of engineering and coding, we're going to automate away a lot of that stuff, like pretty quickly. And so eventually we're going to have to restore some kind of investment in arts, humanities, things that right now strike people as somewhat economically marginal, has to actually increase in importance very quickly. Because if I have artificial intelligence that can do the work of 1,000 accountants in 10 minutes, which I pretty much have at this point, then telling all of your young people, like, hey, getting an accounting degree, it's like a secure profession or whatever, frankly, is misplaced and terrible advice. And so we're going to have to evolve at some point. The problem right now is that we're in the worst of all worlds, where we're pretending that the other stuff we're doing right now is working. It is not working. People are sensing it's not working, but we're all just fixed in the path. We're all in the divot because it's in no one's institutional interest to own up to the fact that we're not actually serving our young people, we're not preparing them for the jobs that are going to exist, and we're chasing the market in a way that's really destructive. I would be totally okay with it if we were to say, look, our purpose here at UNH is not to make you tons of money as a graduate, it's to teach you moral judgment and leadership and how to be a good citizen. That would be the original mission.
So we have a question right here.
First and foremost, clarification. When you're talking about getting a piece out of Amazon, are you talking about a value-added tax?
Yes.
Okay. Then I know more or less where I am, and yeah, suddenly stage fright, and I've lost my question. My apologies.
All right, we have one here.
I grew up in the industrial Midwest, and the corporations that needed to train machinists and tool and die makers and welders, they trained them within the corporations. I have no problem with the universities being, or the community colleges being involved with this, but what's happened to the role of the corporations in actually training their own workforces instead of just complaining about the fact that they can't find trained workers?
Well, corporate America has transformed since, I think, you and I grew up in past decades, where even in my lifetime, like my father worked for 2 companies for a period of years and years. He had something called a pension. Like the number of employers you were expected to have was relatively low. And so they would find you and they'd say, what's that? You're, let's say 21 years old. We'll train you, we'll invest in you, we'll put you to work doing this task, and the task will remain relatively stable. You might be able to do this job for 15, 17 years. You might be able to lead a positive middle-class life on this basis. But then these companies have come under such financial pressure that they now look up and say, hey, I actually cannot assure you this employment for this period of time. We're going to have to nickel and dime you at every turn. We're going to have to make sure that, frankly, we can fire you. I'd actually prefer not to even employ you. I'd prefer that you were a gig worker or a contractor or something that I can just sort of phase in, phase out. And oh, by the way, I'm on the verge of bankruptcy all of the time because I have hedge fund owners who are just beating me down all the time saying your economic returns are not high enough. So these companies now cannot invest in people in the same way. Their processes change too fast, the economics don't work, and their most expedient route is actually to automate away that job. If you go to a factory in the industrial Midwest today, you will find wall-to-wall robot arms and machines doing the work that people used to do, because that is much more cost efficient than, frankly, trying to train someone and then equip them, because the task is going to change so quickly over time. So we're pretending it's still, again, like the 70s or 80s, that companies are going to try and invest in you and employ you for 20 years. Today, they're very unlikely to do that.
We can take a question from in the front, right down here.
What an uplifting presidential candidate, huh?
I was curious, you mentioned forgiving a lot of existing student debt, and it sounds like that's something you're still thinking about. But have you thought about what types of loans you'll forgive, or what criteria you will use to decide which loans to write off?
So our blanket proposal is something called a 10 by 10, where if you commit 10% of your salary for 10 years, then you can emerge debt-free after 10 years. With the thought process being that you still have some skin in the game, it's actually tied somewhat to your economic fortunes, and you have a light at the end of the tunnel. So that's something that most Americans agree would be very, very positive for some people who are maintaining massive, massive debt loads. I'm particularly interested in trying to modify or forgive the loan burden that was generated by some of these fly-by-night for-profit institutions that have burdened people with tens of thousands of debt for things that had very, very little value in the marketplace, and it was clear that many of these people were lured in through false marketing pretenses. So when you have that kind of situation, you have to look up and say, it's on the government that we actually allowed this school to take advantage of our people to this extent. And so forgiving these loans that we know have almost no commercial value, like that strikes me as the place to start. But then you want to try and give everyone at least a light at the end of the tunnel so that they don't feel like they're frankly just working forever to pay off their loans. And I can relate to this because I owed more than $100,000 in school loans myself after I graduated from law school. I used to call my loans my mistress because I was writing a check to a family in another town. I used to say, I hope Sally Mae is having a good life in wherever she lives, Washington, D.C. or wherever she's based.
And kind of to that point, when you're talking about for-profit colleges, what does greater accountability look like for for-profit colleges? And also, if not just for-profit colleges, colleges with maybe low graduation rates or things like that?
I think for-profit colleges deserve extra scrutiny, and many of them are not serving students well at all. Many of them are going in and saying, like, hey, we're helping the vulnerable and the disadvantaged that don't have other means of accessing education, but they're not actually doing them a service. They're putting them in a position where they're just getting sold on false promises, and they have these loans that they're not going to be able to pay back. If anything, the standard should be even higher for a for-profit institution, because it's like, look, if you're going to make money off this practice, we better make sure you're actually delivering value to your students. I have interfaced with some of these for-profit institutions, and they are shady. It doesn't take you long. You walk in and you're like, this is not a cool place. And so if you're the government, it is up to you to protect your citizens against people that are frankly preying on veterans, preying on people that are just desperate for any kind of path forward, and then profiting off of their dreams. It's really quite despicable, a lot of what we've allowed to happen.
Mr. Yang, thank you for your time.
Thank you, New Hampshire. We need you to get on and vote a week from now. Actually, it's the 11th. You know when it is, right? Tuesday the 11th, get out and vote. And you know how soon we're going to know how you voted? The same night, February 11th.
Senator Bennett will be up momentarily.
There's punch down here behind them. All right.
I don't know. He's on his way out. You okay?
Yep.
Good job. You're a master. Born to this.
I'll probably throw a question to you
Okay.
after. So I was going to ask you.
You're going to ask him what? Okay.
This second question.
Okay. I'm going to try and talk Daniela into asking it. Okay.
All right, we're going to introduce our next candidate. Senator Michael Bennet currently serves as the senior U.S. Senator from Colorado. He has served in this capacity since 2009 and has sat on the U.S. Senate committees for Finance and for Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry. Bennet previously oversaw the Denver Public Schools as Superintendent of Schools, and he served as counsel to the Deputy Attorney General of the United States under the Clinton administration. We'd like to welcome Senator Bennet to the stage.
Nice to see you. We have a microphone for you. Thank you. Well, it's a great privilege to be here. Thanks for the introduction, James. How are you? It's good to see you. Let me see. I'm trying to remember where I was. I have spent most of my life outside of politics, but I've been in the Senate for the last 11 years. And as Adam said, before that, I was superintendent of the Denver Public Schools, which is 95,000 kids, mostly kids of color, mostly kids living in poverty in this country. And if I had to summarize the last 10 years of town halls in my state, it is very easy to do it. It's people coming and saying, Michael, we're working really hard, but we can't afford some combination of housing, healthcare, higher education, or early childhood education. We can't save. We can't live a middle-class life. We think our kids are going to live a more diminished life than we lived or than their grandparents lived. And if I think about the families I used to work for in Denver who don't come to my town halls because they're working 2 and 3 jobs, what they would say is they're killing themselves, and no matter what they do, they can't get their kids out of poverty. And that's the anecdotal reflection of an economy that for 50 years has not worked for 90% of the American people, has worked very well for the people at the very top, but nowhere else. It's an anecdotal reflection of the lack of economic mobility that we have. We've got the lowest economic mobility of any country in the industrialized world. And we've got the worst income inequality that we've had since 1928. And worse even than all of that, our education system is actually reinforcing the income inequality we have as a country, because the best predictor of the quality of a kid's education and how far they go with their education is their parents' income, to the point of savagery. And I don't think we're ever going to attain the promise of this democracy or of this economy if we don't figure out how to turn that around. There was a time in the middle of the 20th century when education was the wind at our back. Today it is a force to contend with, because it is a headwind against economic improvement for the American people, and that's a real problem. And I've got some ideas about how to change that. But in the context that we're here tonight, I thought I'd talk very briefly about college affordability, which is one of the things straining at our system. College costs too much. We all know that there's $1.6 trillion of debt, national debt of college students, and I have not supported free college. I've supported the idea that we should do what we can to cap the repayments that students have to make, to cap it at about 8% of their income, to cut it from 20%, which is 20% more over the Obama rates, to say that if you've made your payments over 20 years, we'll forgive your debt. I believe families that are making $75,000 or less, I think their kids ought to be able to leave college debt-free, and we'd be able to do that early in the first term of a Bennett administration because of how we're going to change, substitute loans with Pell Grants. But I believe as a country our objective should be graduating kids debt-free from college. I don't think there's any reason you should have to go into debt for the privilege of getting a college education. Having said that, my campaign's a little different than some of the other candidates, some of them because, having been a school superintendent for a bunch of kids living in poverty, I know the challenges they face, and I know that free preschool is much more important for them than free college is, and it's also much more progressive. I know that we got to do something for the 70% of kids who graduate from high school but never go to college, who today are consigned to making the minimum wage when they graduate from high school. And there's absolutely no reason why they shouldn't be able to earn a living wage when they graduate from high school. And I have suggested we spend $500 billion over the next 10 years. That's $50 billion a year to retool high school and retool community colleges, which I would make free in a Bennett administration, so that when people graduate from high school, they graduate with a year of community college under their belt and the skills they need to be able to earn a living wage in their community. That would transform the lives of millions of Americans, and I think transform the American economy. The last thing I want to say, and then I'll open it up to questions if that's okay. And by the way, I'm here, I'm happy to take questions or criticisms on any topic. Please ask me this stuff. You might not ask another politician because you'd be worried that you'd hurt their feelings. As I said, I was an urban school superintendent for a long time. You cannot hurt my feelings. They were beaten out of me a long, long time ago. But this is all we're having. I think the context in which we're having this conversation is really very important, because there are so many dimensions. In fact, I would say every dimension where my generation is letting your generation down, those of you that are not part of my generation or, that are here. And it's serious. I mean, and I can think of a number of ways that we're doing that, some of which are invisible to you, maybe. The fact that we're not investing in our infrastructure in this country, and we're leaving the bill for you to pay. The deferred maintenance for you to pay, because we don't have the decency to maintain the assets and infrastructure that our parents and grandparents built for us, much less build the infrastructure you're going to need in the 21st century. The fact that, we've got $22 trillion of debt on the balance sheet going to $30 trillion of debt on the balance sheet, and at the same time we've done that to you, we have cut our investment in you by 35%. The reason why you have to borrow all this money for the privilege of going to college is we have cut the taxpayer support for public education, even though we enjoyed the benefit of taxpayer support for public higher education when my generation was here. And I don't need to tell any of you, because you're more worried even than my generation is about these problems with climate change. And on top of it all, we've got a democracy that is not functioning right now, that's broken. The institutions in Washington are broken. And I believe it is just a fundamental aspect of being an American, that part of our job is to make sure we're leaving more opportunity, not less, to the people coming after us. And if we don't figure out our politics over the next 10 years, my generation will be the first generation of Americans to break that promise, which is why I'm running for president. So with that, I'm happy to take questions from you.
So
thank you.
The first question is going to
step on my own applause. I'm always so surprised to get them that I thank you.
So the first question is actually kind of about how your higher education plan would deal with federal-state partnerships. One of the things that we learned during the Obama administration, some red states aren't willing to take on that federal-state partnerships, particularly with Obamacare. So I guess would kind of relying on that federal-state partnership leave some red states out, or do you think that they would get on board?
Well, obviously, I wouldn't want to leave anybody out. I wouldn't want to leave red states out either, but I think it is important to figure out how to, and you can also do this in ways that comprehend the poverty levels in the state, so you're not actually using federal policy to further penalize poor people, which so many of these states are doing right now. But I do think that it is important for the federal government to reward good behavior, and I would say here, the most important thing we could do is use the student loan program to incentivize state universities to keep their costs down. I mean, one of the things that is not solved at all by Bernie's proposals on free college and free and forgive everybody's student loans is that the reason why we're here is that college costs too much. That is the problem that we've got to solve. People wouldn't have to borrow this money if college didn't cost as much. And I think there are universities throughout the country that are beginning to understand that there is an important market in America for university presidents to be able to say to students, if you come to our college, we will work together to make sure you graduate debt-free. And I think the federal loan program should be rewarding those kinds of places by giving people more of a chance.
I'm going to take a question from Daniela.
Hi, Senator.
Hi.
Only 60% of students graduate within 6 years. Is that a bigger problem than affordability? Because that's not always the reason why students don't graduate. And how would you address it?
I think that it is I think it is many of the reasons why people take that long has to do with affordability. It's not the only reason why. I've worked very hard since I've been in the Senate and worked with the Obama administration to create year-round Pell, because it didn't make sense to me that kids shouldn't be able to have the benefits of Pell Grants during the summer as a way of keeping their education going so they didn't have to delay it later. I also think that, I think every community college in this country should have daycare at the community college for people that are students at the community college, and we don't have that as a society. I mean, think about the number of young people that you know or I know that are single parents who simply can't deal with the combination of figuring out how to get the higher ed degree and at the same time deal with the child care that they have. So I think from the standpoint of federal policy making, where you're dealing with people, many of whom are like 250 years old themselves and think they're experts on education because they got one 230 years ago, they're still looking out in the world and saying, this is a 4-year degree and it looks just the way it did when I was going to school. And of course, it looks nothing like it did when they were going to school. So I think we've got to meet students where they are and got to make sure that they can afford this. I believe fundamentally the problem is that college just costs too much. That's the real crisis. I mean, we have a debt crisis because college costs too much. If it didn't cost so much, we wouldn't have the debt crisis that we have.
So one more question, then I'll open it up to the audience. So you mentioned a little bit earlier that we should be looking at pre-K. We should be looking at kindergarten, the things that people are going to be most likely to be going to. But before the Common School movement, right, a lot of Americans weren't going to K through 12. So I guess would making college free make it so that more students would be going to those institutions? Do you think that free college would enhance college going culture?
I think it would help. Which is different. That's different than the student loan forgiveness. But there's no question that making college free, all college free, would make it more available to people and help solve some of the problem that we're talking about. But I think it's not the most progressive way of doing it. I think it's a regressive way of doing it. I think families that can pay should pay, and that families that shouldn't pay should not have to take out loans, but should have the ability to work and have student aid like the Pell Grants to get them through. That's what I really believe. But you point out something that's very, very important. I don't think there's anything more at war with who we are as Americans than the fact that if you're born poor in this country, your chances of graduating with a 4-year degree or its equivalent are 9 in 100. I often go to the floor of the Senate and they say, if these desks, there are obviously 100 desks in the Senate, if they represented poor children in America instead of senators, only these 9, I was going, this one, 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 and this one, they would be college graduates. Everybody else in this chamber would represent somebody who never made it. And if we, the senators, face those kind of odds for our own kids, we wouldn't be in the Senate. We would rush home to try to fix the problem. But we're treating America's kids like they're someone else's kids, not like they're our kids. I think all of this is a false choice. I think the fact is we've got to figure out how to approach our education system, pre-K all the way through college, as a coherent arc. We have to focus much more on transitions than we have historically done, because what happens is when kids transition, whether it's from elementary to middle to high school to community college or to college to a job, those transitions, unless you come from a family that's wealthy and is experienced at it, those transitions can be very difficult, and that's where we lose kids all along the way.
I'm going to open up the floor to questions. She's going to start. Oh, there's one. Yeah, there's one right back there. Yeah.
Hi.
And actually, if you could use the microphone just for the live stream.
I'm sorry. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Juliet.
Hi.
I'm wondering where mentorship fits into, especially people that fall between the cracks. Whether it's, hey, I need an additional skill in addition to being an English major, and then I can do my dream job, but I need to know what that skill is and where to get it. Or, hey, where do I apply for a loan? Where do I get this extra scholarship funds? Where does that fit in? Because a lot of people just don't know where to find things.
Yeah.
And once you leave high school, you don't have that guidance.
Totally right, totally right. So having talked about how, I've got some priorities other than free college, I guess I should have said, and I will now say, that I am very proud that I live in a city where last year we passed a sales tax increase in Colorado to fund something called the Denver Scholarship Foundation. I helped start that when I was the superintendent of the Denver Public Schools. And what we said to all of our kids in Denver was, look, economics will not keep you from going to college. And we funded it through a philanthropy for the time that I was superintendent. Now it has a recurring revenue stream from the people of the city and county of Denver, the taxpayers, which says to every kid in Denver, finances will not keep you out of college. And for me, one of the great privileges of my life has been going back to Denver and meeting kids, which I do all the time, who are now not the first one in their family to go to college because their older brother, their older sister actually was able to go because of what we were doing with the Denver Scholarship Foundation. Critical to the success of that has been mentorships. We put in our high schools, in every single of our high schools, something that we called a future center where kids could come, learn what the FAFSA form was, help get the FAFSA form filled out, to be able to select colleges, other scholarships. We said you're not eligible for the Denver Scholarship Foundation unless you've applied for 2 or 3 other scholarships, which are available to kids living in poverty, not as a way of making their lives miserable, but just as a way of leveraging the money that we had. And then there is no question that once kids get to college, it's critical for them to have either mentorships or advisory, whatever you want to call it, because resiliency is a huge issue for young people coming out of districts like the Denver Public Schools. What we have discovered, though, as we've tracked the kids over time, and it now has been, a decade or more, is that they are just as resilient as the kids coming from more affluent backgrounds. You never know what's going to interrupt the kid's education. It could be transportation issues, it could be housing issues, it could be, being a single parent, it could be just tiny things that can disrupt somebody's ability to get a degree. And if you're helping solve those problems in real time with the student and having them also acquire skills so they can mentor each other, you see tremendous resiliency. If you don't do it, you don't get it.
Here.
Senator, you mentioned a lot of investment, but you also mentioned the debt and the deficit. So what are your plans to reduce the debt and the deficit so that you can make these investments?
So I have proposed a total of $6 trillion of spending in this election, and I've shown how I will pay for every dollar of that. That does not reduce the debt and deficit. It does not make matters worse. And for just orientation, Elizabeth is now up to about $41 or $42 trillion of what she's promised. Bernie Sanders is up to $55 trillion, and he wears it as a badge of honor that he's not paying for any of it. I don't think there's anything progressive about putting all this debt on the next generation and failing to invest in them. I think it's a disaster, and I think the fact that we've got this debt on our balance sheet is a generational theft from them, and you should care about this. I don't hear a lot of young people talking about it. You should be furious at us. Ask, what have we spent the money on? Well, part of the problem is we've got a healthcare system that's twice as expensive as any other industrialized country in the world. So we are spending about 18% of our GDP on healthcare when every other industrialized country in the world is spending about 9% on healthcare. We got to fix that problem. I think we need to create transparency in our healthcare system. We got to negotiate drug prices. I think we got to cover everybody with a public option so people can choose whether they want private insurance or a public option. I believe if we head down the road with Bernie, we'll fight a losing battle for Medicare for all for the next 10 years. We'll never beat Mitch McConnell. We'll never get the Senate back. We're not going to be able to do the things that we need to do. And then 2 other things, and you guys should be enraged by this. Since 2001, we have borrowed $5 trillion from the Chinese to give tax cuts to rich people. We have borrowed $5.6 trillion from the Chinese to fight 2 wars in the Middle East that lasted for your whole lifetimes. that did not get the results that we said we were after. And we have to stop doing that. And it's on the basis of that that we've been putting the debt on their backs, and we got to stop doing it. I find the taxes in particular are just such an unbelievable, offensive thing because, you know, if any mayor of any city in New Hampshire went to the people of that town and said, I'm going to take out more debt than I've ever borrowed, than our community's ever borrowed before, and you said to them, well, that makes me kind of nervous. What are you going to spend the money on? And they said, I'm not spending it on infrastructure. I'm not spending it on the schools. I'm not spending it reducing the cost of college for people in the community. I'm not spending it on the sewers or the libraries. I am going to take the proceeds of these tax cuts and I'm going to give it to the 2 wealthiest blocks of houses in our community. That is what we have done since 2001. That is what Donald Trump did with his tax bill. And it is a travesty. And we got to stop doing that. I mean, that's 11 or 12 or 13 trillion dollars. Everywhere I go in New Hampshire, you know, I hear people say the schools aren't as good. We don't have access to health care. We don't have access to mental health. We don't have access to addiction treatment. College is too expensive. That is a reflection on our abject failure to invest. If we had taken that money, we could have, and used it differently, literally, we could have fixed every road and bridge in America. We could have paid every teacher in America an increased salary of 50%. We could have given every kid in America who needs it preschool. We could have extended the life of Social Security for my daughter's generation, and we could have paid down some of our debt and deficit. And instead, we decided we were going to break the bank to give the wealthiest people in the country tax cuts at a time when income inequality is higher than it's been since 1928. You cannot make this stuff up, and that's why it's so important for you guys to participate in this election. We got to change the direction.
We have a question down here.
Senator, I know you think a lot about financially vulnerable Americans, and we've learned in the last couple of years that surprising numbers of college students are food insecure or homeless. I wonder if you have plans to address those problems, either for college students specifically or more generally.
Yeah, this won't mean anything to a lot of people here, but it will mean something to you. Billy Shore endorsed me in this race because of my anti-poverty plan and because he said he hadn't seen a better anti-poverty plan out of a presidential candidate ever. And he said, I am just glad to see a candidate who's willing to talk about poverty and not just mask it as middle class. 22% of the kids in this country are living in poverty in this country, and the kind of insecurity you're talking about is throughout our society. And so what I propose that we do is massively increase the child tax credit. I show how I pay for this, by the way. Massively increase the child tax credit so that instead of having it be $2,000 a year, have it be $3,600 a year for kids under the age of 6, $3,000 a year for kids over the age of 6. Columbia University has studied that plan, and they've said that it would cut childhood poverty in America by 40%. You want to see kids be able to achieve educationally, nothing's more important than reducing poverty, in my view. Only good things happen from that. It would end $2 a day poverty for kids. A gigantic increase in the earned income tax credit as well, so middle-class people get a tax benefit. They would also get a huge tax benefit from the child tax credit to make work pay again in America, and so we stop taxing people into poverty, which we're doing in the United States. I think paid family leave ought to be something that we have, and I believe we got to raise the minimum wage, although I have said not to 15 everywhere in America, because there are some places like my wife's hometown in the Mississippi Delta in Arkansas where if you got a $15 minimum wage, you're going to put everybody down there out of business. And I've been beaten up for that, but I'm just being honest about it. You know, where we can afford it, we should definitely have it. If you look at a place like Denver, we should be having a $15 minimum wage, but that may not apply equally everywhere. And these are the things, you know, that I think we should be focused on as a party, in the Democratic Party, because they have 70% support across the American people. You look at something like Medicare for All, on the other hand, which is basically irrelevant to the kids I used to work for in Denver. Only 30% of Democrats support that. And I think there's massive opportunity costs if we go down a road where we're nominating a candidate who's got a policy that only 30% of the American people want, instead of nominating somebody who's got a set of policies that can actually build political momentum so we can have a progressive era in this country, which we desperately need to have. We will not be able to do that if we don't have a set of policies that unifies people, in this country, that brings back some of the 9 million people that voted twice for Barack Obama and once for Donald Trump, and allows us to win in purple states. And that's why I've proposed the agenda that I have.
So with a divided Congress, is there anything in your agenda that you think could practically be passed? Because I mean, even some of the, on higher education at least, even some of the agenda in the Higher Education Act is incredibly bipartisan, but is not moving.
Yeah, a couple things. One, I will say that just within the last month, Mitt Romney signed on to a child tax credit with me. It's not as generous as the one that I'm talking about here, but it is fully refundable. And that is the first time that a Republican member of Congress has been on a fully refundable tax credit. That's important because if it's not fully refundable, what that means is that if you're some of the poorest people in America don't get the benefit of the tax credit because there are people in Congress who have said, look, you have to show that you're earning some income before we're willing to give you the tax credit. And instead, Mitch has agreed with that, and that's a big step forward. But second, look, you're never gonna, our entire government, our exercise in self-government has been immobilized by this cast of characters that was first, they called themselves the Tea Party, and now they call themselves the Freedom Caucus. And they came into Washington as a reaction to Barack Obama's election, and they made his life a misery for the last 6 years he was there, and they made the American people's life a misery for 10 years. And their priorities are basically a set of priorities that they stole from Sarah Palin, I think, and her constitutional interpretation of what the founders were doing when they created this country. Those people cannot be compromised with. They're incapable of compromising, and neither is McConnell until he starts to lose. And when he starts to lose in these purple states, we're then going to be able to make progress in Congress. That's the truth. It's not going to fix itself. You can't hope that they're going to behave better this week than they did last week. We have to win elections all across this country. And when we win those elections, then the terms of the political debate in Washington will change. And I think then we can get through what needs to get through. Until then, it's going to be very, very challenging. I said on the floor yesterday during the impeachment debate, this is supposed to be the world's greatest deliberative body, the United States Senate. Guess how many amendments we voted on last year? You'll never guess, so I'll tell you, 28. We passed 8 amendments last year in the Senate. It is a broken institution, and as long as the political lines are drawn the way they are there, it will remain broken. The good news is we can fix it with elections.
Have time for maybe one more question right down here.
I forgot my last question due to stage fright, so I wrote it down this time.
I hope you're not frightened of me.
It's the crowd. You're just like my favorite uncle, to be honest.
Okay, I'll take that. I'll be happy to take that.
So this is going to sound mean. I really don't mean it that way.
I said you couldn't hurt my feelings. Maybe you will.
I wouldn't want to try, but $6 trillion annual budget. Why can't your political opponents, are they evil, ignorant, or just plain stupid? Seriously.
Which one?
I will include Bernie and Elizabeth, but also the Republicans. Why can't anyone get federal spending under control? Why, in God's name?
That's not a mean question. It's because instead of thinking about the interests of the next generation, they're thinking like politicians. And the equities of a politician mostly is, if I can tell people that their taxes are too high, but we can spend more money, that'll make people happy. And that's what we've been doing. And as a result of that, we've got a federal budget where 17% of it is what we spend on defense, 16% is what we spend on domestic discretionary spending, 65% is Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and interest on the debt. And there's no way to fix that, I don't think, unless we do something about health care in this country and we stop wasting the money the way we did the last 20 years. And it's pitiful. I mean, Trump The guy, well, I know a Republican colleague who asked Trump, don't you worry at all about the deficit? You know, this is after a party tortured Barack Obama over and over again when we had a 10% unemployment rate, when we were in the worst recession since the Great Depression, when he was doing the stimulus package and they were saying, you're a Bolshevik, you're a socialist, look at what you're doing. You know, the reality is Clinton, when he left a surplus. Bush cut taxes in 01, 03 and went to Iraq and Afghanistan. By the time Barack Obama got there, it was a $1.2 trillion deficit. The worst it ever got under Obama was 1.5. He left when it was at 600 billion. Trump's trying to take it to 2 trillion. 2 trillion. For what? Nothing. And what he's saying is let the people have their money because for him it's all bread and circuses. He's like this Roman emperor who's just spending it and spending it and spending it. So that is the honest answer to your question. So can I say one last thing that's not an answer to the question, but is that all right? And it is this. I'd obviously love your support in this campaign. I'm not as well known as other candidates. I think you have a sense of what I'm thinking about and worrying about. But let me put that to one side and just say this to you, especially to the young people that are here. I asked somebody who's a university president not that long ago about political activity on the campus, and it was not in New Hampshire. And the president said, everybody hates politics and everybody hates politicians. And I said, you know what? I know a lot of these guys and I hate a bunch of them myself. But then I said to her, what was it like when you were in college? And she was in college in the late 60s, you know, when the height of the Vietnam War, civil rights movement, all that. And she said, we believed that our country would fail without us. We believed that our country could not survive unless we were involved. And I'm telling you this, the stakes are just as high right now. And we will not survive without your involvement in our politics. And my plea for you is that between now and next November, you will personally decide that you will do everything that you can do to make sure that every single person who's eligible to register to vote actually is registered to vote, and that every person who's eligible to vote, votes. If UNH could say, and I'm not just talking about UNH, I think you've got a responsibility that's bigger than that, but if UNH could say, you know what, 100% of the people on our campus who are eligible to vote voted, 20 years from now when people are looking back and saying, oh my God, we thought we were lost when Trump was president, but instead we ended up with this long progressive era that led to investment, that led to an economy that actually worked for everybody, that restored America's place and leadership in the world, restored integrity to our government and to our democracy in the White House, that it started here where people said, we're not going to make excuses. We're going to get everybody to the polls and we're going to demand that the country change direction. We will be lost without you, and we need your help now. So thanks for having me tonight. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for your time, Senator.
Good seeing you. Appreciate it. Thank you. So, you didn't answer though. You're playing stupid. It is that the Democrats don't care and the Republicans say they care, but they're lying. I like that. That's really the answer. I appreciate that.
Okay, a program update. I think what we'll be able to do is Governor Weld will be able to start a little early, so we'll be starting him in about 10 minutes. So.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. If you know any members, you can write a letter. All right. Thank you. Oh, yeah.
After the marathon session earlier, as far as if he gets here, I mean, if we have a 10-minute break before him, it's fine. Just
So,
I'll buy you a drink. If you drink.
Yeah, I do.
Okay. You know?
Yeah, actually, I had a radio that was canceled tomorrow morning. So
Okay.
I was supposed to be on video. I see it.
I'll show you the town.
Yeah.
I'm going to be on Fox on election day up here. That's fun.
It'll be fun.
Yeah. By the way, we have some snack food over here if anyone wants to grab something real quick. If you're getting a little peckish. Why didn't you say that earlier? So Governor Weld will be up here momentarily. If people could take their seats and kind of, you could maybe, come a little closer so the man feels like he's, talking to you. Really? I told you that wasn't going to work.
Is he on his way up? You said he's on his way up. Yeah. Heard it through the grapevine. All right, we're going to get started. Presidential candidate Bill Weld is a former two-term governor of Massachusetts, elected in 1990 and then again in 1994. He was the first Republican to be elected governor of Massachusetts in 20 years and was ranked as the most fiscally conservative governor in the country by the Wall Street Journal and the Cato Institute. Prior to being elected governor, Weld served as the United States Attorney for Massachusetts. I'd like to welcome Governor Weld. Microphone for you right here. If you'd like to, some opening remarks. Should be on. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm Bill Weld. I was governor of Massachusetts twice back in the 1990s. I have 8 children and 9 grandchildren. My principal qualification for being here, my wife and I have 3 millennials at home, including one who just finished a 1-year program at Columbia School of Journalism and is the beneficiary of $110,000 in debt. So this is an issue of some concern to me. Just a few thoughts that I've had about how to attack the problem of student debt. Number one, I think we have to repeal the outrageous provision in existing law that says that student debt is the only kind of debt in the world that cannot be renegotiated. And students are told when they get their loans, there's 2 ways you can get rid of this debt. One is by paying it off in full, and the other is by dying. But that's, they might as well hang out a sign saying, "We hate students." In terms of numerical ways to attack the issue, we really don't want people to be indentured servants till they're 40 years old, having this student debt. So I think after a certain period of time, a short period of time, say 3 years, interest could be forgiven until the student has a job that will pay at least 250 times the federal poverty level. And further down the road, I think if someone pays principal and interest for, say, 15 years, there should be a tax-free forgiveness for the student loan, because we don't want people saddled with that into their 40s and 50s. Those are just some opening thoughts.
So to start with just a couple of questions. The first, so you've suggested that you would support kind of tuition-free community college. And that's kind of out of step with a lot of national Republicans. So I guess, what is one of the things that you're kind of hearing on as you're going around the country that kind of makes you want to back that as a national Republican?
Well, I think I'd want to focus particularly on lower income students to give them kind of a leg up. And it would be either 2 years of community college or the last 2 years of a state college program.
And I guess in conversations with voters, is that something that's resonating when you're talking to Republicans?
I think the sort of thing that resonates with voters. Another thing I would do is expand the public interest loan forgiveness program, where if someone agrees to spend, say, 5 years teaching in public schools, that would work a complete forgiveness of their debt. And that makes some sense to me. That's kind of a trade-off, so people can work their way out of the student debt.
We have a question here. James?
Governor, I wonder if you had a thought about the politics around free college, which, obviously we've been talking about how it started at a state level with a Republican governor, but at a national level is associated primarily with Democrats. And is there, have you had trouble selling it to other Republicans, or why do you think other Republicans haven't gotten excited?
Well, my proposal is not the Bernie Sanders proposal that all of college should be entirely free for everybody. I like to focus on people who need it the most, and that would be lower income students. Matter of fact, because of the divisiveness in the country now and the extent to which the president has divided us all, I've begun to worry about the social fabric in general. And I think as a prudential matter, it behooves us now to be looking at income inequality and student debt, and which, as you know, prevents students from, taking the job that they want, which may be a more interesting job with a lower salary, because they can't do that because they have to repay their debt. That's just one of the things holding back entire groups of people. So I'm not saying everything should be free. I'm focusing on the people that need it the most. Similarly, a big problem we're going to have in 10 years. This is not student debt. This is a different one. But just very briefly, we're going to lose 10, 15, 20% of all the jobs in the United States because of, artificial intelligence and drones and robotics. And driverless vehicles. What to do about that? There will be replacement jobs. They will require 3 semesters of training at the community college post-high school education level. And those, I think, should be free to the people who need that training to get their job back. And again, that's kind of an emergency, so that's worth making an exception for. That's why that should be free. And the reason I think things should be we need to make these provisions to address the student debt problem is that's holding entire classes of people back. So we just need to make a special effort for them. But it's slightly more targeted than something like the Bernie Sanders proposal.
And how do you ensure that community colleges at both the state and the federal level are being invested in at the level that's necessary to do some of this additional training and things of this sort? Because one of the issues that some community colleges run into is that they simply don't have enough resources to focus on completion.
That is true, and my proposal to make all this available to the displaced workers as a result of automation at the community college level, that can't be done by waving a wand. The community colleges need to up their game. Some community colleges have graduation rates as low as 6%. So that's really not going to work. By way of example, we did a major K through 12 education reform when I was governor, and we were in good shape economically at that point. So I put a whole bunch of money on the table and said, I'm going to use this to equalize funding, because when I came into office, the affluent suburbs west of Boston were paying $26,000 per pupil per year, and in Roxbury, Dorchester, and Mattapan, which are the minority wards of Boston, it was $6,000 per year, and that was totally unacceptable. So we used the $7 billion that I put on the table to equalize funding across districts, and the teachers' unions were happy to have the $7 billion. And I said, but not so fast. I want some management givebacks in return, which were in the form of standards and accountability, the sort of thing we'd have to do for the community colleges as part of this program. And it was a high-stakes test in 4th 8th and 10th grades, and if the students didn't pass the test, they wouldn't go on. And the other part of it was no more social promotion, because what was done, and this was really unacceptable, there was the teachers in the inner city schools were, let us say, not they were not chosen by the union because they were the most fabulous teachers, and as a matter of fact, quite the contrary sometimes. And so there was a desire on the part of those schools and those teachers to promote the students, to move them through the system. Social promotion does nobody any favors, least of all the student who's receiving the social promotion. So they get to 12th grade, and the teachers say, Johnny, here you are, here's your diploma, congratulations, you've been here 12 years. And they'd go on to community college and take remedial math and reading and flunk out of both of them. Now, nobody profited from that. So that's what I mean by standards, and you'd have to work out something like that at the community college level to increase their standards before they could be the solution to the question of how do these displaced workers, as a result of automation, get the replacement jobs. But you work it all out, it's a good deal, because the replacement jobs would be higher wage jobs than the jobs that they lost.
Well, I'm going to open it up to questions in just a second, but before I do, that was actually going to be my question was, what does that accountability look like at the community college level, or even for higher education kind of more broadly?
Well, it would look a little bit like what we did at the K through 12 level in Massachusetts, and it does require resources. It can't be, you know, you're dumb, get smart. So it would require resources, but it would also require a more accountability at the community college level. And I think, you know, they feel a social responsibility to give the kids in community college every possible chance. But I guess the theme is you're doing better for the kids if you expect and demand more of them than if you just let them ride through.
So we have 2 microphones on each side. While we're looking for questions, I wanted to ask about the economic benefits of free college. So Tennessee, of course, heavily conservative state, Republican governor, Republican legislature, has passed a tuition-free community college model, and one of the things that they base it on is the economic benefits for the state. I guess what are the arguments for the economic benefits nationally of kind of tuition-free community colleges, even kind of like a measured
well, there's a strong argument if the community colleges are equipped to turn out graduates who are qualified to take the jobs that 2 years of post-high school education should equip you to take. That's not always the case. As I say, I know community colleges with a graduation rate of 6%, and it takes a lot of, you know, getting into the weeds. It takes both more resources for the community college, but it also takes higher expectations for their performance.
One down front.
Yeah. So this applies to both the K through 12 system and higher ed. So there's accountability to schools, but of course a lot of the reasons the children in the schools are not doing well, and the kinds of schools you were describing that you were trying to help in the K through 12 system, a lot of the problems they face are not within the 4 walls of the schools, and a lot of the reasons they don't thrive in the schools is because of that.
Oh, that's for sure.
So I just kind of, how do you sort of see the broader picture, and what do you think needs to be done outside of the classroom so that those children can start succeeding?
Well, you know, there's a lot of claims for resources, and the more I get around the country, the more I see, for example, childcare is now a major issue for many women to equip them to be able to go and take more full care of all of their children. It's kind of great-grandchild of the Family and Medical Leave Act of the early 90s. It's and that'll be another rallying point. But you know, everything does take resources, and I was on the board of an organization called the Harlem Children's Zone in Manhattan for 7 years, and they had a lot of resources. It was funded by a guy called Stanley Druckenmiller, and he was reclaiming Harlem block by block, starting from 125th Street and Madison Avenue, and they started the mothers off before they even gave birth to their children. Then they sent them to something called baby college, and they had to sign agreements to improve the neighborhood and the house that they lived in, and then they would get a mortgage. So that was an extreme example of everything necessary being provided. And that's nice work if you can get it, as they say. But obviously, the after-school programs, early childhood education, everything is going to help along the way. It is a question of expense, but I do think that there's something of a crisis, and we're wandering from student costs and debt, but there's a crisis in ensuring that our graduates are going to be equipped to take the jobs that are going to be in the more technical economy in about 10 years, and that starts from the ground up. So, meaning from birth. So there's no stage too early to focus in on to make sure that those kids can prosper and thrive with that education.
And where does graduate school debt kind of fit into this whole picture, right? In terms of the student loan crisis, people taking on more and more debt for graduate school, say even maybe potentially graduate degrees that aren't maybe going to be as lucrative as a doctor or a lawyer. Where does that fit into this picture, and how do you make sure that you're managing the cost, that colleges are managing the cost?
Well, I mean, something that lies in my mind with respect to graduate school debt is we have to make sure we don't have predatory lending, selling kids on taking on an enormous amount of debt for a job that is never going to equip them to have a salary that will enable them to repay the debt. That's a one-way street and not a pretty one. So I'd want to focus on the danger of predatory lending there to make sure that people didn't get over their head.
We go right here.
Hi, Governor. So to touch on something James mentioned earlier, this has been a robust debate, the conversation around college affordability, debt-free college in the Democratic primary. It doesn't seem to, and maybe I'm wrong, but the conversation doesn't seem to be happening as much within the Republican Party. So I'd love to get your opinion on, why do you think that is? Why does the conversation on the other side seem to not so much focus on this particular topic, but more things like we need to deal with teachers' unions or other, things like that?
Well, I think of Senator Sanders and others as having a position that college should be entirely free. And, I think there's a feeling on the Republican side, and I'm perhaps quicker to say we should worry about income inequality and worry about preventing students from becoming indentured servants quicker than some others on the Republican side. But many Republicans say that Democratic proposals in the presidential year too often are expressed in terms of dollars. Oh, you think this should be free? We think this plus something else should also be free, and that's not generally accepted by Republicans across the board. They think that it's a pie in the sky thing, and as I say, I'm not a typical Republican. I'm more willing to get into the weeds, and the older I get, the more problems and suffering I see, and I think that government has a responsibility to everybody. I worked years ago on the Nixon impeachment. President Nixon was obliged to resign because he violated his oath by failing to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And I was thinking about this and the words "take care," and the more and more I've thought about it in the 12 months that I've been running, I think the president, as the CEO of the country, as it were, has a duty to take care of every identifiable group. And at the end of the day, every individual. And my theory of a democracy is something where the individual can never be thrust in a corner. But as long as we're pursuing policies, as I think are being pursued in Washington today, that allow whole groups of individuals to live in the shadows, maybe waiting for a knock on the door, that to me is not a democracy. That's a despotic regime, such as we saw in between the wars and during the war in the 1900s, the Second World War. So, I'm willing to go quite far to make sure things like that don't happen. I'm not sure that's the starting point for many Republicans, many people in my party, and certainly not for the current administration.
A question here, and then one here.
Okay, first and foremost, I want to say I'm a supporter. I voted for you and Gary.
Hey, thank you.
I'm one of the 3% or whatever. So as background, we've got a decreasing labor force, an increasing retired population. Overall, the tax base is shrinking. Roughly right now, we spend, half again what we raise in taxes. Presumably, we'd fix that somehow as part of addressing the education crisis. How? I mean, not roving euthanasia squads or something. How?
Well, assuming we spend half again as much as we take in taxes, the solution to that is to stop the trillion-dollar deficits, and you do that by zero-based budgeting, which means instead of doing what they do in Washington and taking last year's appropriation for each account in the budget as a starting point and saying that unless it rises 10 or 15% every year, that's a cut. It's only in Washington that those are called cuts. And you know, what we practiced in Massachusetts, and I came in, I had a 16% shortfall in the budget. When I came into office, January 3rd, I had to file my budget, which had to be balanced February 28th. So we went through a very quick exercise of zero-basing the budget. I had the advantage that governor was my first elected office, so I didn't know there were sacred cows in the budget. I didn't even know that they were cows. So I was distinctly dry-eyed as we approached the budget. And it doesn't mean you have to take out your meat cleaver for every single account in the budget. For example, if there's a preventive health program that produced a lot of good outcomes last year, outcome being the result of the expenditure, input being the appropriation itself, then you might multiply that by 5. But if you find a sprawling bureaucracy that no one can quite tell you what it does, but it's very popular because it was a beloved, now deceased senator who was chairman of Ways and Means, and now it has a lot of political fathers and mothers because it employs a lot of people, that's a candidate for going to zero, even if it's a big appropriation. So we found that that worked. There's not the stomach for that in Washington because Lord knows everyone in Washington knows every sacred cow in the budget by its first name. You know, it's a difference between Washington and the state capitals. Every state except for Vermont is bound by its constitution to have a balanced budget. You know, in Washington, and I fought like crazy to get a balanced budget amendment through earlier in the late 90s. That's a tough sell in Washington, D.C., and that's a big part of the problem. But that's how you solve the budgetary problem. And it takes a skill set and a political will that people in Washington don't have, and that's both parties. And that's not Mr. Trump's fault. That's equally shared by the legislature.
Got a question here and then one there. Yep, have one right.
Thank you. This is more a college question than a debt question. Could you tell us a book or two that inspired you when you were yourself in college?
One was Louis Hart's The Founding of New Societies, who's the author of the statement that in a democracy is a place where the individual shall never be thrust in a corner. I guess it was the nascent libertarian in me. Then when I got to law school, I read Friedrich Hayek, The Constitution of Liberty, that kind of sealed the deal. So those were a couple that inspired me. There were many that thrilled me. Nabokov's Pale Fire. I majored in Latin and Greek, so that's a good start for having an appreciation for literature. But those were two that definitely influenced me politically. You know, I remember the chapter from Friedrich Hayek, from the Constitution of Liberty on progressive taxation. And Hayek tells the anecdote that when the progressive income tax was being debated, the opponents said, well, if the Congress can impose a graduated tax of 0.5% on income, what's to prevent some future Congress from imposing a tax of 1% or even 2% on income? And the counter argument that carried the day was, don't be ridiculous. The possibility of abuse of a power is not a sufficient argument against its existence. And that carried the day. So I took Economics 1 50 years later, and the marginal rate was 91%. I offer this just in the context of some of the plans that have been offered this year, say a 2% tax on wealth. Mark my words, that 2% would be 75% within 10 years. And so that means it's really going to wind up being quite a different program than it started out. That's my view anyway.
Question here?
Hi, my question is about community college. And before I came to University of New Hampshire, I went to the highest graduation rate community college in Connecticut. And what I saw there was people like my advisor, who was the only history professor, the only political science professor, the only philosophy professor, and he also ran 4 clubs on campus, including the entire honors program. So my question is, how do we give support to community colleges so professors can focus on teaching their students and give community colleges enough money that they can hire more professors?
Well, you're right. It's a straight resources question. If I may, what was the graduation rate?
It was 60%.
60, yeah, no, and Connecticut is a high performance state. I think that would be an unusual community college. But education does respond to resources. And I'm well aware that to follow my plan for what to do about the displaced workers as a result of artificial intelligence et al., that's going to take some resources. But it also calls for standards and accountability at the community college level. And I think with resources, it could be like our grand bargain that I did with the Democrats in the legislature and the teachers union, who are not part of my natural constituency, but we saw a problem, so we thought we had a duty to fix it. And the high stakes tests and the fact that if your scores were low enough there were consequences for that. People didn't necessarily like that, but until we passed that law, Massachusetts was slightly below the middle in terms of reading and math scores nationwide, 26, 27, 28. After we put that in and made it stick, Massachusetts was #1 in both reading and math every year for 25 years in a row, up to the present day. So I don't know why more states haven't followed that model.
So, but for institutions like the one that she attended, where you do have a significant graduation rate and you do have a professor who's teaching several different classes, how do you kind of as the opposite to making sure that the institutions that have the low graduation rates are being are kind of being held accountable? How do you ensure that those institutions are being held as models and also being?
Well, I would definitely hold them up as a model and say to everybody else, listen to this professor. Maybe he can teach a 5th course, which is how to run a community college, because obviously they're doing something right there. Yeah, I mean, it's a question of paying attention and having excellent superintendents of education and people paying a lot of attention to higher ed and the community. Community colleges and state colleges are a big part of producing a workforce as well. And generally, I think they're better funded than the community colleges, and perhaps we're working around to the view that the community colleges maybe should be first in line, particularly if they're going to be an instrumental part of educating the workforce of the technical future that's almost upon us.
So I actually have one more question just about kind of in this conversation of sending more people to community colleges, vocational training, things like that. There's always a concern that more low-income and minority students will be kind of tracked into careers that may not be as well-paying as they may have if they went to a 4-year college. So I guess how do you assure that with this kind of commitment to combating artificial intelligence and things like that and preparing people for the workforce, that you're ensuring that you're not tracking some students, low-income minority students, into those paths when they may have had an opportunity to do something else?
You mean how you prevent people from going into occupations that are not going to fit them for those technical jobs of the future? That's a matter of preference.
Well, typically students with more resources, right, may have the opportunity to take the chance to say, oh, I can go to law school. Maybe I go to college. Maybe I go to law school. Whereas a low-income student may not know what's possible. You look at the sticker price of a school.
No, that's right. And that brings me back to the issue of predatory lending. And perhaps that's a matter of education of the students. Watch out for this when your friendly student lender approaches. One other thing I meant to mention earlier is the interest rate on federal student loans could certainly be adjusted downwards, part of the initial salvo.
One last question, and then I'll wrap. So most of the candidates who are in the presidential race are running to the left of Congress right now. So what are some of the things that you think could practically be done to address the cost of college in the Senate as it's made up currently, or in Congress as it's made up currently?
Well, I think I think the proposals that I mentioned at the outset, expanding the public interest loan forgiveness program, that, it seems to me, should have a bipartisan constituency in Congress, although I think a lot of things should have a bipartisan constituency in Congress, and they don't. So how to crack the nut of the Senate Republicans, I don't know. I mean, I thought last Friday was a dark day at Black Rock, and not quite sure what to make of the Senate Republicans going forward. You know, I've worked with most of the senior people there for years, and I've never seen them take actions such as were taken on Friday. So I don't want to predict easy success there, but that, it seems to me, is the public interest loan forgiveness program is a win-win. So that should have a lot of support. And how you introduce things can make a difference. If you just say college should be free, you know, a lot of people are going to turn off their hearing aid. But if you say, we got this problem, and this is a step to take on the road to addressing it, and it will cost exactly this much, and actually there's 3 ways we could do it, A, B, and C, and pays your money and takes your choice, you're probably going to be further along the line in getting a consensus. But if you come in with just the top line and say, my way or the highway, you're never going to persuade anybody.
Governor Will, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you. This lives here, right?
So continuing our theme of former Massachusetts governors, Governor Patrick is expected quite shortly. So.
Low sugar, definitely.
Yeah, you doing okay?
Eating as many chocolates as possible. I don't have diabetes or anything, but sometimes I feel like I do.
I understand that completely.
Okay.
Let's.
How you doing, Tyler? I'm getting tired. You're young. You guys got the right. Remember when I broke Juggle badly? We were thinking if we had to put some what?
Probably walk out the front door to go drive.
He went that way.
He went that way. Lock 'em. Throw a hip check.
Remotely locked. Wish more people stayed after Yang.
It's right. People know to take a list.
She was supposed to be here at 4:30, but unfortunately she wasn't able to make it. Unfortunately, I was excited to see her.
Not able to make it? Just blew us off.
Nice
She
work.
lost my vote.
She dropped off number 2 on my list.
You don't know what it actually is. No, this didn't come. That's why. No, it was because we confirmed with her Tuesday. Her staff said Tuesday she was coming. And then she just turned around. So. It was good on Tuesday. We'll see what happens. Michael, by the way.
And Tulsi has a lot of other events around the state.
Nice meeting you. Thanks for
Tulsi
coming.
has a lot of other events around the state, so hopefully you can make it to some of those.
All right, good to hear it.
I'm not sure exactly, but I'm sure on her website she has.
It's been good. It's been good. They're all interesting people. That's what I keep saying. That's the thing.
That's why it's a very big time.
Yeah.
And there are multiple things. And I thought that I would be able to meet all of them. Elizabeth didn't but she sent us representatives. Are you from?
Yep, I live right here on campus. I think over the next 5 days, you'll probably get a chance to meet everyone around this area. I know Yang ran off to an event in Dover. I'm sure other people have similar events like that.
Are you going to see on Monday?
I'll actually, I'm an EMT on campus. I'll be working that night, so maybe I'll run into him. He has another heart attack. But hopefully he doesn't. Yeah, he had a heart attack last time he visited here. So, well, not when he was here, but right after he left. So I'm thinking maybe there's something going on.
What are you studying?
Biochemistry. So nothing at all to do with political science.
Okay.
It's fun to see the candidates. Especially Tulsi.
It affects all the people's lives.
I can check her website if you want to see if she has events around here, because she focuses on New Hampshire a lot. Yeah, I bet she will. Let's see. Last time she was here, it was a good talk. So definitely.
You have seen her?
Yep, she was here in October, I think.
Okay. She came to the university?
Yep, for the same general format of the thing. Okay, let's see. LC2020.com. I give her money. I just want to all of them this year. Just around here. Okay. Search for it. Say the 6th. She's doing a lot. Okay. Oh, you know what? Those aren't things she's going to be at. Let's see. She's in Lebanon. That's far out of the way. Oh. That's why she was.
Yeah, she got. I've seen this web page, and that's why I was surprised when I see that she was coming today, because it says she was going to be in other.
Yeah, an hour from now. And Lebanon is pretty far away. I think it's.
Yeah, it was
So tomorrow in Somersworth. That's pretty close.
What is Donut?
It's veterans. Oh, Rochester, that's only 20 minutes from here.
I will be able to get there by.
I think you can.
I will try.
If not, there's Uber.
Okay.
Isn't Portsmouth? I know we definitely have buses.
I know that.
Yes, we have
Yeah.
buses going there.
I know Portsmouth. That is February 9th.
That's Sunday.
Yeah, Sunday.
Concord, no, a little bit further.
And how do you know if events are free?
I think they're all free for the most part.
Yes.
Yep, and then I think you just RSVP. They'll let you know if she's actually going to show up or not.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if I show up and she's not there, and I'm
Disappointed again.
Yeah.
Yeah, looks like last event was on the day of voting, so. I'm not Manchester. A little bit further.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Good luck.
Should I announce that?
Yeah. Well, it's very easy to sign your life away for a loan. It's incredibly easy. And no one harps on how bad this is going to be long term. It's very easy.
Nobody told me how long I was paying off my gas, applications, and interest rate compromise.
Yeah.
I didn't even understand what any of that was.
Well,
I was like, oh, you're giving me money to pay for my applications. Right? And a lot of it, I thought,
Getting that chocolate in really helped. Sorry.
All right. We are about to get started. If everyone could take their seats. So, presidential candidate Deval Patrick served as governor of Massachusetts from 2007 to 2015. He was the state's first black governor. Prior to successfully running a campaign for Massachusetts governor, Patrick graduated from Harvard College and Harvard Law School, served on the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and led the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. Governor Patrick, thanks so much for being here.
Great. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for the warm welcome. Can you hear me okay? Great. You've had a long day, but an important subject, and I'm glad to be here. I am sorry to have missed the early presentations from students who I'm sure told stories like those I have heard all over New Hampshire and all over the country about being so trapped by so much debt just when launching into life. And it's interesting, I'm always urging people who are coming out of college to take chances, to go into public service, do something that is that really is about following your passion, but that is impractical for so many students who are dealing with that monthly nut. Public colleges and universities got to this place, it seems to me, if Massachusetts is any indication, and South Carolina, two places I have focused a lot on. What is it, $34,000 all in for in-state tuition fees and such? 54,000, I think, is the number at UNH today. We have come to this place in large measure because we've been gradually draining the public out of public universities and colleges. In Massachusetts, I remember when I took office, we were at about a 25% annual contribution to public college and university budgets. We got that back to about 50-50 in exchange for freezing tuition and fees. I think it's down to 10% in South Carolina. And frankly, we're not going to get to where we need to get until we put public 100% back into public colleges and universities. And then, You add to that the compounding problem, which is that so many public colleges and universities have been trying to use that formula that private colleges and universities have used, which is to say raising tuition to as high as the so-called market will bear, and then promising to offer financial aid for those who can't pay it. By the way, that formula was never going to work in the public setting, but when it also is aligned with this notion that financial aid should be mainly debt rather than grant, you see how we get what we get. So in a Patrick administration, I want to make two commitments. First is that we eliminate existing student debt. We do that, in my view, first by refinancing debt to current interest rate levels, which are at or near zero, and doing that retroactively. That will eliminate a whole lot of people's debt. And then with the remainder, I would frankly favor raising the estate tax and using proceeds from that, and I say that rather than the wealth tax, but using proceeds from that to eliminate remaining debt. The second challenge we have is accessibility going forward, and that comes back to the point I was making earlier. Public colleges and universities are not going to be truly accessible until we make them 100% supported by the public. Here's the part I haven't worked out. I believe we have federal resources to commit to this. States take very, very different approaches in terms of how much they do or do not commit to public higher ed, and trying to make sure that as the federal government closes the remaining gap, that states don't say, okay, here's an opportunity for us to fund nothing at all and step back, that sort of carrot and stick I frankly have not worked out. But I think we're going to have to work that out, because I don't think that the right thing is to have the federal government simply supplant state responsibilities for public colleges and universities. Exactly how we get the right formula so that it is sustainable beyond 8 years of a Patrick administration is something I think I'd love to work with all of you and others on. So why don't I stop there and we can have some conversation.
Yeah. So I guess my first question, you mentioned that you hadn't quite worked part of this out, but just thinking through one of the things that you were alluding to, which is essentially that most states haven't gotten back to their pre-recession spending in higher education. So I guess, is it through maybe state-federal partnerships? How do you get, particularly with this vein of mistrust in higher education right now, how do you get states to kind of buy into the fact that maybe college is worth it, like it's still worth it?
Well, look, first of all, I mean, you just asked me the question I said I hadn't worked out yet, so I appreciate that. I don't, by the way, I just fuss with you on one premise of the question, if I may respectfully. I'm not trying to get back to pre-recession levels. This was a problem before the recession, right? This gradual retreat by state governments from public higher ed. I've heard Republicans in Massachusetts say, well, we don't need to spend so much on public higher ed because we have so many terrific private colleges and universities. It's not the same thing. The quality of the education may be comparable, but the accessibility is the whole point of having public higher ed. I think, my view is that every dollar the public spends on education, pre-K through higher ed, is the single best buck the public spends on our collective future. And in an increasingly knowledge-based economy, I don't hear this to say that I think everybody has to go to college. That's not what I'm saying. But in an increasingly knowledge-based economy, the investment of time and ideas and money in education, up to and including public higher ed, is critical. Otherwise, we keep disadvantaging our future. And to coin a phrase and to sound trite, I don't mean to be, you are our future. So I think that the question as I say, you asked me, I told you before you asked me, I didn't have an answer, that has to be sorted out is what is the formula that makes that assures that we sustain the kind of commitment I'm talking about beyond a Patrick administration, and that you have states where leaders come and go, governors come and go, legislatures come and go, and it's been easy to sort of raid the public college and university budget when times are tight and states have to balance their budgets. Let me say one more thing. So this is something HBCUs have been dealing with for a long time. And in a plan we put out called an equity agenda for Black Americans, I have proposed endowing HBCUs as a way to kind of take the pressure off the annual allocation. I have not proposed endowing public colleges and universities generally, but that may be a way to get at what you're asking about. But I'm working this out as we stand right here.
Yeah. And to that point, kind of about racial equity in higher education, one of the things that we discussed a little bit earlier was essentially, Black students are more likely to take on student debt. They're more likely to default on those loans, and when they do take on student debt, they're more likely to take on more student debt. So I guess, how do you address kind of that racial component of outside of HBCUs? How do you address that racial component of student debt and of this kind of debt crisis?
This won't be the whole answer, but I'll just tell you from my personal experience. I didn't ever really get any training on financial management. I was figuring it out as I went. I don't think I was that unusual as a first-time college goer from other Black people who were trying to figure it out. And there were certainly times when I felt, and my wife felt, like our student debt was never going to go away. But I can tell you, the amount of money that we were managing is chump change compared to what you guys are taking on today, because the numbers are completely different. And then you come out of school, or have come out of school, like in my kids' time, right into a recession where we were not growing, and their place in it seemed very unsure. So we have to do more than one thing. We have to, in addition to making college and university accessible, we also have to be working on growing an economy out to the middle and the marginalized, and not just up to the well-connected, so that there is a place for you to pursue your future, build your future, and pursue your dreams when you're ready.
I'm going to take a question from down front.
Governor, thanks for coming.
Hi.
You talked some about public colleges and private colleges. You've also talked in the past about problems at for-profit colleges, and I wonder if you could say a word about what you think about quality at for-profit colleges, and if there is a problem, what you would do about it.
Well, I think we've got the biggest problem, a big problem with for-profit colleges. I'm going to assume that the debt issue is a debt issue across education. But a big problem with for-profit colleges is that they don't actually deliver the educational opportunity that they advertise. They take in students, they collect the loans. I mean, you've seen some of the most egregious examples, and then some of them disappear. Actually, I think one of the most egregious examples was named after the current president. Am I right? Mm-hmm. There are rules and regulations around just basic cheating of consumers that should be applied to enforced against those kinds of colleges. Now, there is other online training that I know of, and in fact have been involved in, that is low cost and self-paced, and where the debt issues are not of the type we're talking about. And we should encourage, whether it's for-profit or not, we should encourage more than one way for people to get skills training, particularly middle skills training, which is a huge need in this country. Some will get it through community colleges, which in my view should be free. And some will get it by online, more targeted, sort of certification driven, and they should be affordable and they should be supervised in terms of the quality of the instruction and whether the outcomes are exactly what are promised. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So we have 2 microphones on each side, and we have a question here.
Governor, you talked about the for-profit trade schools, and I get what you're saying, but in fact, many public schools take kids on who have little or no chance whatsoever, based on their lack of preparation, to be able to graduate from that institution. So they're saying, come here, give us your parents' money, go into debt.
Right.
Should they be subject to deceptive trade practices lawsuit based on their false promises to, in many cases, more than half their students?
Well, the answer is yes, unless they can actually produce those outcomes. I mean, there are lots of young people who are not prepared for all kinds of settings, but where the academic institution is committed to and does succeed in getting them prepared. That's the point. So I'm trying to be careful, though, not to say it's all about outcomes, because people are at different stages of their lives and development. We used to beat up on the community colleges in Massachusetts because folks weren't graduating in 2 years or 3 years, when in fact the population was sometimes coming for a course or 2 and then stepping back because life intervened, because they were older students, they were adults, they were putting it together. So it's trying to understand the mission of the institution rather than the mission of a whole class of education opportunities, I think, is probably more important. So I'm not quarreling with you. I'm just saying that if you're not prepared and the mission is to get you prepared, I want to acknowledge that and celebrate it. If you're not prepared and the mission is just to harvest your family's resources and any loans that you can persuade someone to give you and then kick you to the curb, yes, we should come down hard on those kinds of institutions. Does that make sense? Okay. Sorry.
Well, Governor, I think you know,
hey,
because
Bill. How you doing?
As you know, because I called you the day after you announced and told you this, I greatly admire what you're doing in this year's campaign.
And you.
And I'm pleased to say that I think after former Governor Romney's vote to convict the president of an offense for which he was obviously guilty, we can welcome Governor Romney to the Good Guys Club for this time.
Indeed, well
great,
said.
Great to see you.
Nice to see you. Nice to see you. You know what, if I may, I know this. It's good to see you. Just on this subject, it turns out a lot of democracy depends on unwritten rules, right? Duty, decorum, restraint, honor. And I have other quarrels with candidate Romney from 2012. He did a stand-up thing this week. He did a stand-up thing. It's a great reminder.
We have one more question down here.
Go ahead. Are you ready? Do you have one? Okay. I have lots of questions.
I was Instagramming that moment, Brett.
Oh. That's going to blow up. Governor, we haven't talked a lot today about the problem of capacity at public colleges and community colleges. And it's not one that seems to feature very much in this debate. We focus on asking states to spend more on affordability, but not necessarily to spend more on capacity. And
by that, it's James, right?
Yes.
By that you mean making more
seats available. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And as a governor, I'm sure that's something you struggled with on a budgetary basis. How do you weigh the trade-off of investments in keeping tuition down or scholarships versus opening new campuses? And do you have a way of thinking about whether we should be, how do we prioritize our dollars on affordability versus improving quality versus making more opportunities available?
Well, it's a good question, hard to answer in the abstract. There's more than one way to make education accessible and available. We have traditional kind of agrarian calendars we should reconsider. We have, I happen to think, Bill will know what I'm talking about, that the co-op program at Northeastern is one of the best ways to, for modern education, because a whole lot of people learn through, and frankly, most people learn effectively through experiential learning. That has implications on how many people have to be in the building at any given time. There's more and more distance learning. Even the private colleges and universities are doing that. As we focus, as I hope we focus more and more on filling this middle skills gap. So these are, you know what I'm talking about? I remember when, in the height of the recession, we had 175,000 people looking for work in Massachusetts and 125,000 vacancies at the same time. And what employers were telling us was that they couldn't find people with the skills necessary to do the jobs they had. And many of those jobs, not all of them, but many of those jobs were so-called middle skills jobs. So jobs that required more than a high school diploma, but not necessarily a college degree. It was targeted training for certifications of some kind or another. That is a huge and growing challenge in America, and it will continue to be as the economy changes. So how do we deploy community colleges, for example, to take up more of that, to meet more of that responsibility? And much of that, not all of it, but much of that can be done through distance learning. So I don't think it's quite lends itself to a formula. We should be about the objective of making opportunity available to anyone who needs it, and having our public college and university alternatives be the one that is truly affordable.
We have one right there, third row back.
Governor Patrick, you mentioned you went to Harvard College.
I did.
Could you tell us what you liked about Harvard and what you didn't like about Harvard?
Oh man, is this off the record? I had a ball. It was. I mean, there were people from all over the world. People who spoke different languages, people who came from all kinds of backgrounds. Of course, for probably the first 2 or 3 years, I was certain someone was going to come and tap on my door in the middle of the night and say, don't want to embarrass you in front of everyone else, but we made a mistake, and here's your ticket home. It turns out everybody's feeling that way. Everybody but Bill, but everybody else was feeling that way. But it was big, and I like big. I like complex. I like the opportunity to be self-directed. It's not for everybody, and I think the people who were the saddest characters there were the ones who were there because they felt they should be, and not because they had really considered whether it was the right place for them. And it's a funny thing. I remember when I got in, I'm going to stop after this, but when I got in, I called home and I got my grandmother on the phone, and I said, Gram, and I was first to go in my family to go to college, and I called, I said, Gram, I'm going to college next year, I'm going to Harvard. And she was beside herself and yelling and screaming, and then she paused, and she said, now where is that anyway? And I remember being devastated, my goodness, until I reflected on it years later. And I began to understand she appreciated that moment better than I did, because what she was excited about was not the prestige, it was the opportunity, right? And that's what matters.
So there's a question in the back over here.
Hi, you talked about middle skills and sort of community colleges and things like that. A lot of people get to a point where they need another course or two, or they need to get these trainings, and there really is a huge gap. And if you have no money or you're working minimum wage, to be able to afford that next step.
Right.
Like you just like, do I buy coffee? Do I put on a 30% credit card? Like,
right.
Do you see about that?
Yeah.
Because that's a huge gap right now.
It is a huge gap, and we used to talk about this as stackable credentials. you understand what I mean? So that if you, let us say, got partway through a program at public college or university X, and there a later time came when you wanted to add something else that might help you get all the way to your associate degree, or simply, as you say, another course that enables you to ready yourself. But it needed to relate to the work you'd done at the first institution, being able to stack those so that they counted. And that has a whole lot to do with making the qualifications and the elements of the coursework overall standard or more uniform. I guess I would put it that way. We did some work on that in Massachusetts. There's more work to do on that, but that approach is important. The affordability question, though, goes back to what I was saying. I think a public college or university should be where you should expect to go if you are looking for an accessible alternative. For some people, that's going to be free, and for some people, that's going to be low cost, so that it is genuinely affordable. Community college, as I said earlier, should be a part of a pre-K to 14 free public education. And if you have to step away, you have to step away. If you come back, there's a place for you. 4-year colleges and universities, I think there should be a charge, but it should be a charge that people, regular working people, can handle. And if there is going to be financial aid, and there should be, it should be weighted in favor of grants and not loans. And if the price is low to begin with, that works.
One question right here.
Thank you, Governor.
Hi.
Hi.
Nice to see you.
You too. Building on affordability. Early on in the campaign, you talked about having a public service component in which people would do 2 years, and then that would give them 1 year of free tuition. I'm wondering, is that idea still in your portfolio of how to address affordability? Because it's unusual.
It's 1 for 1. So what you're asking about, Madam Dean, is the Universal National Service proposal, which is a part of what we call our democracy agenda. And the idea actually came not from the interest around college affordability. It came originally because I'm so concerned about how divided we are, and I have been concerned about how easy it is to divide us. And I think the reason we are so easily divided is that we don't know each other in this country anymore. So the idea was to offer opportunities paid, so it isn't just, the kids of the well-to-do, but paid for 17, 18-year-olds to take a year or 2 or 3 of public service, civilian or military, working alongside other Americans from other parts of the country, other perspectives, other backgrounds, in service of some unmet national need. And in exchange for which, for every year, you'd get a year of free tuition. So I think that's what you were getting at. But that was not the reason for it, but it seemed like a good way to further incentivize folks. And I'm hoping it becomes a custom. I don't think we're quite ready to do what Israel does. I wish we were, frankly, but I don't think we are quite ready for that. But some notion of how we build over time, again, a sense that we have common cause, I think is critical.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You have 1 minute for a closing statement.
Maybe I'll just take a question or two more rather than.
Could take one more question.
One more?
I'd seen a hand go up right here.
Right there?
Oh.
What'd you do to him that he won't now recognize your?
I don't know.
Well, I had seen hers go up before.
I don't know. Was it my smile? That's a really, really awesome idea. I'd like to know, for me at least, the full total cost of college was the reason why I went into debt. And I'd like to know what ideas you have to tie grants and aids to the total cost of college as opposed to tuition.
Yeah.
Because, I come from the great state of California. As great as it is, it's super expensive, which is the reason why I'm in debt. I was fine with my tuition, but the total cost, which was the cost of living, was the reason that put me into debt.
Yeah, I don't think you're so different from other students. Actually, the tuition. I mean, there's a sort of a game that's been going on in a lot of public colleges and universities where the tuition is held. You know, it's not low, but it's lower. But the fees are astronomical.
Yeah.
Right. The mandatory fees.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're asking about the public service, the national service idea, when I said a year of tuition. Fine, a year of tuition and fees. I get it. You know, you have to. It's got to actually work. It has to actually be meaningful. I get that point. There's a whole lot of work to make these ideas into actual policy. And I will just say, maybe as I close, that as you think about the candidates who are running, understand everybody has ideas, but I have results. And the way you get to results is just like this, right? It's iterative. You engage. You have an idea. You set a goal. You bring in others who have things to contribute to how you get to that goal. They may even have a different points of view about how you get to that goal. But when you think about the progressive agenda that we've been talking about in a lot of our primary, whether it's healthcare or the quality of public education or climate change or criminal justice reform, everybody's talking about plans, and that's great. I've delivered those results. Remember that when you go to the polls. Thank you very much. For your
Governor Patrick, thank you so much.
Hey, Michael.
Should I close it out? Yeah. Okay, wait a minute. You guys have to listen to me thank people, because a lot of people deserve a lot of thanks. So Tyler Silverwood, he's here somewhere. He's, and all the folks from the Campus Living Association have been running mics and helped with registration, a whole host of things. Thank them. Of course, Adam Harris, James Gual, and Daniela Gibbs-Leger. Guys got stamina. And then I'd just like to thank some people from the Carsey School who've, behind the scenes you haven't heard from yet. Sue Colucci, Nick Gosling, Laurel Lloyd, and Jordan Hensley have been shuffling people up and down and doing all sorts of stuff. And then from TICAS, the Institute, College Access and Success. I had the wrong name in my mind for a long time, so I've been breaking out of it. James, of course, but Shannon Serrato, Angelique Palomar, and Madison Weiss. Have I forgotten anybody? I hope not. Thank you, everybody.